Section 1. The Collector at the End of Forever. Somewhere in the cold depths of the eastern fringe, past the light of civilized stars, and beneath a sky that has not changed in 60 million years, there is a tomb world called Solemnace. From the surface, it looks unremarkable barren, windswept, its ancient plains of gray dust stretching toward a horizon that never promises anything warm. No birdsong, no weather worth naming. No sign of life in any of the forms that mortal beings would recognize as living. Just silence, pressing down like a physical thing, thick and heavy and impossibly old. The kind of silence that makes you feel, if you stood there long enough, that the universe might have been like this everywhere once, before anything foolish enough to breathe decided to show up. But underneath that silence, underneath those plains, the galleries go down and down and down. Corridor after corridor of living metal, dim and cold, lit by a faint green luminescence that seems to come from the walls themselves rather than any visible source. The glow is the specific shade that Necron technology tends to produce a color that exists somewhere between bioluminescence and the afterglow of something recently and terribly energized, a color that does not occur in nature and that organic beings find, on some instinctive level, profoundly wrong. The corridors are wide, taller than they need to be for beings of Necron proportions, as though built to accommodate something larger, or as though the architect simply preferred space. The floor is absolutely smooth, polished to a mirror finish that reflects the green glow back on itself and doubles it, so that you are surrounded by light from both above and below, and the effect is of walking through water in some lightless deep. And in those corridors, stretching for what might be miles in every direction, there are things on display. Objects of unimaginable rarity, artifacts whose origins predate the existence of humanity by numbers so large they stop feeling meaningful. 60 million years, 62 million. Deeper still in some cases, back to the era when the galaxy was a fundamentally different place, inhabited by fundamentally different powers. Technologies whose underlying principles are not merely lost but have not been independently derived since the first sun was old. Weapons that the most senior artificers of the Adeptus Mechanicus would sacrifice entire colleague rosters simply to look at. Cultural artifacts from civilizations that do not exist anymore. In most cases, because the civilizations in question made the mistake of being in the way of something that wanted their world, or their resources, or their lives. And among all of it, standing in poses of eternal, unbreachable stillness, are people. Some are suspended in fields of energy that hold them perfectly motionless, their expressions frozen at the exact moment of their capture, fear, defiance, confusion, the specific blankness of someone who has not yet understood what is happening to them, sometimes something approaching peace. Others have been transmuted into something stranger still, woven into living holograms that play out the moments of their greatest deeds on infinite loop, trapped not just in space, but in a specific fraction of a second, repeating forever without awareness of the repetition, or perhaps with full awareness and no capacity to escape it, soldiers who fell 1,000 years ago. Warriors from species that no longer exist, figures of history that the rest of the galaxy has spent centuries searching for, mourning as lost, or simply forgetting entirely because memory without a record to anchor it erodes away like everything else. They are not lost. They are here. They are part of the collection. And the one who collected them, the one who walks these halls with the unhurried patience of something that has nowhere else to be and all of eternity in which to arrive, who pauses at certain displays and tilts his head in the particular angle that means he is satisfied with the arrangement, who occasionally rearranges something with metal fingers that move with surprising delicacy for weapons of war, who mutters catalog entries to himself in a language that predates every language currently spoken in the galaxy, is a being that defies easy categorization. He is not exactly a villain, though he has committed acts that would see him tried and executed by every civilized authority in the known galaxy. He is not exactly a hero, though there are worlds still standing today, because he chose, for reasons that had at least something to do with preventing the galaxy from becoming less interesting to collect from, to intervene on their behalf. He is not exactly cruel, though cruelty is woven into the fabric of almost everything he does, the way dye is woven into cloth. And he is not exactly sane, though his mind operates with a precision and cold intelligence that would shame the greatest scholars of any living species. His name is Trazyn the Infinite. self-proclaimed archaeovist of the Solemnace galleries, overlord of a tomb world on the edge of civilization, thief of moments and stealer of history, the most accomplished collector in the history of a galaxy that has been producing collectible things for approximately 14 billion years, and in a universe full of horrors that compete enthusiastically for the title of most disturbing entity to walk between the stars. He might be one of the most quietly unsettling things out there, because unlike the horrors that want to tear your soul apart, or devour your world, or corrupt you into something unrecognizable, Trazen just wants to add you to his collection. He thinks that is a kindness. He might not be entirely wrong, and that is the part that should worry you. Tonight we are going very deep into the lore of one of Warhammer 40,000's most beloved, most peculiar, and most philosophically interesting characters. We are going to talk about where he came from not just as a Necron, but as a person, because he was one once, and the shape of that person is visible still in the collecting impulse that defines everything he does. We are going to talk about the worst deal in galactic history, and what it cost his people. We are going to walk through the galleries of Solemnace and look at what is in there, and confront what it means that any of it exists. We are going to talk about the rivalry that has lasted 10,000 years, about the fall of a world he chose to help defend, and about the philosophy of preservation in a universe that destroys things faster than they can be made. This is going to take a while, and that is entirely appropriate, because Trazen the Infinite has been doing this for roughly 60 million years. We can afford to be thorough. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. It genuinely never gets old. It is remarkable and strange and sort of beautiful that a video like this reaches people across time zones and continents and entire hemispheres. And I want to know where you are. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is an excellent moment. There is substantially more Necron lore coming, and considerably more Warhammer 40,000 lore in general, and you are not going to want to miss any of it. Now, let us go back to the very beginning. Section 2. A people born under a dying star. The Necron tier. Every great tragedy needs a beginning that felt, at the time, like ordinary life. The Necron tier had that. They were a people who emerged into the universe under circumstances that should have destroyed them before they ever developed the ambition to reach for the stars. And the fact that they survived long enough to become one of the most powerful civilizations in galactic history is, depending on how you look at it, either a remarkable testament to the endurance of intelligent life or the universe's cruelest practical joke. They lived on a world that was fundamentally hostile to life. Not challenging in the way that evolution produces and hardens a species, by making them earn every generation's survival hostile in a deeper way, a structural way, a way that suggested the universe itself had made a clerical error by allowing life to develop there at all. Their homeworld orbited a star whose radiation output was catastrophically, relentlessly high, a star in an unstable phase, whose solar winds carried ionizing particles in quantities that penetrated the surface of the planet and soaked into every living thing present, passing through skin and tissue and cell wall as though none of those things were much of a barrier to anything important. The result was a species with one of the shortest natural lifespans of any intelligent race that has ever existed in this galaxy. They died young. They died of radiation-related cancers that their bodies produced almost as a default state. They died of complications arising from those cancers, and from the treatments they developed for those cancers, and from the stress that constant proximity to death imposed on organisms that were intelligent enough to fully understand their situation and would have preferred it to be otherwise. They built, as all species that live close to death tend to build, enormous funerary monuments. Their architecture was obsessed with preservation, with commemoration, with the marking of individual deaths, because each individual death was so frequent and so early that it demanded acknowledgement. Their culture was saturated with death, the way that some cultures are saturated with religion, not because they chose it as a theme, but because it was simply the air they breathed, the water they swam in, the fundamental texture of being alive in their particular situation. And yet they were brilliant, ferociously, almost compulsively brilliant, in the way that beings who know their time is limited often are. There is a particular quality of intelligence that develops in the shadow of mortality, a kind of urgent creativity that does not have the luxury of hesitation. The Necron tier had this in abundance. They built, they engineered, they developed technologies that let them reach past their poisoned homeworld and spread across the stars, seeding colony worlds and building an empire that, at its height, occupied a significant portion of the galaxy. They expanded with a ferocity that was inseparable from their grief. Every new world, a refusal to be contained by their origins. Every colony, a proof that they would not be defined by the star that had tried to kill them. But wherever they went, they carried the resentment of those origins with them, carried it like a wound that would not close. They had done everything right. They had survived what should have killed them. They had built what the universe seemed not to want them to build. And still they died young. While out among the stars, there were other beings who did not have this problem. The Old Ones were the species that occupied the dominant position in the early galaxy, ancient beyond easy reckoning, masters of the warp, the psychic dimension that underlies normal space, masters of biological engineering, capable of shaping life itself at the genetic level, of extending the span of living things through techniques that the Necron tier, for all their engineering brilliance, had not been able to replicate. The Old Ones were, in many ways, the galaxy's gardeners, seeding life across worlds and tending it across the ages with a patience that came naturally to beings that measured their existence in epochs. The Necron tier looked at the Old Ones and saw everything they had been denied: longevity, biological mastery, the effortless immortality that came from being a species that had simply never been plagued by the particular stellar bad luck that defined the Necron tier condition. They approached the Old Ones and asked with what must have been an enormous effort of pride if the secrets of longer life could be shared. Whether the knowledge that the Old Ones had of extending biological existence might be offered to a suffering species that desperately needed it. The Old Ones declined. Whatever the exact reason, indifference, caution, a cosmic arrogance that didn't register the Necron tier's suffering as sufficiently significant to address the answer was no. And this was the wound that did not heal, the foundational grievance around which everything else crystallized. What might have been ordinary longing became something harder, darker, more consuming. The Necron tier civil wars were fueled in no small part by the simmering awareness that this was all there was, that their empire, for all its achievements, was being built by people who knew they would not live to see what it became. It was during this period of fracture and frustration that the C'tan made contact. The C'tan, beings of pure energy, ancient beyond the capacity of mortal mathematics to properly represent, who had spread themselves across the surfaces of stars and fed on stellar radiation since the earliest days of the universe's cooling. They had no real form until the Necron tier, with extraordinary ingenuity and even more extraordinary desperation, engineered bodies of living metal necrodermis to contain them and allow them to walk in the material world. Bodies that functioned like shells for something that had never before had a shape you could point at. And the C'tan, given form, and given worshippers, and given an entire civilization of desperate, resentful, dying people to manipulate, made an offer. They offered immortality, real immortality, housed in bodies that would never decay, never suffer the ravages of radiation, never fail. All they needed was for the Necron tier to submit to the process. The process was called biotransference, and accepting it was the worst decision any species has ever made in the history of the galaxy. Section 3. Biotransference. The gift that devoured a people. The biofurnaces were enormous. This detail matters because scale is part of the meaning here. This was not a quiet, private catastrophe that befell a handful of people who made a bad choice. It was a civilization-wide transformation, systematic and all-encompassing, conducted on billions of individuals simultaneously across multiple worlds, managed with cold efficiency by entities that had been patient for billions of years, waiting for exactly this kind of meal, the Necron tier submitted. Dynasty by dynasty, world by world, the people who had built the most technologically sophisticated civilization of their age walked into chambers designed by their gods, and emerged as something that looked like them, but was not quite, and the energy of what had been taken from them in the transition rose like smoke, and fed entities that had been waiting for exactly this feast for a very long time. Illuminor Siras, the most gifted scientist the Necron tier had produced, a being who would go on to be one of the most consequential and reviled figures in Necron history, refined the biotransference process into operational reality. The C'tan provided the underlying principles. Serraz, with his particular genius for applied biology and engineering, turned those principles into functional machines. The biofurnaces worked because of his intellect, and the Necron tier became what they became, in no small part because of his willingness to provide them. He would spend the next 60 million years dealing with the ramifications of that contribution, though not in any way that involved remorse. The process worked. That, as must be emphasized again, is the most disturbing part. It worked exactly as the C'tan described. Every Necron tier who entered the biofurnaces emerged on the other side in a body of living metal. They did not age. They did not sicken. Radiation could do nothing to their new forms. They were, by any technical definition, immortal. And as each person went through the furnace, the C'tan feasted, because the process of encoding consciousness from biological substrate into metal releases something in the transition. The life force, the thing that animates organic beings in a way that is qualitatively different from the animation of a sufficiently sophisticated machine, the thing that warp-sensitive cultures call a soul, pours out of the organic body in the moment of transition, and does not make the journey into the metal form with the rest of the person. The C'tan were positioned around the biofurnaces specifically to catch this outpouring, to consume it, to take the souls of an entire species, one by one, as each Necron tier passed through. What emerged from the furnaces were the Necrons. And the Necrons were not, in any essential sense, the Necron tier. The lower ranks, the warriors, the workers, the vast majority of ordinary people emerged as something much closer to sophisticated automata than to the beings they had been. They functioned. They could follow orders and execute complex tasks and respond to their environment, but they did not feel, not in any meaningful sense. The richness of experience that had made their brief organic lives worth living, the grief, the joy, the complex layered inner world of a being that knows it is mortal and builds its life in full awareness of that knowledge was gone, consumed. The nobility fared somewhat better. Those with sufficient wealth and status to have their neural encoding done with more sophisticated equipment retained something approaching their former selves, a shadow of personality, an echo of motivation and preference. But even they were diminished, haunted by a peculiar flatness where their inner life had been, a hollowness that they could identify as an absence without being able to fully describe what was missing, because the very faculties that would have let them describe it were part of what had been taken. Sarek, the Silent King, supreme ruler of the Necron tier, watched the C'tan feed and understood, in his new metal mind's cold and clinical way, that he had made a catastrophic mistake, that the price had not been the organic bodies they no longer needed, but the essential thing that had made those bodies worth inhabiting. He could feel the hollowness in himself, could feel the vast emptiness where something important had been, could not name it precisely because the part of him that would have known its name was part of what was gone. The C'tan, newly empowered to a degree that made them essentially unkillable, turned the hollow metal armies toward the Old Ones and the war that the Necron tier had wanted for so long. The Old Ones fell. The war in heaven ground to its conclusion over millennia of devastation. And when it was done, when the Old Ones were gone, the Silent King made one more decision. He turned the Necrons' weapons on the C'tan. It was not entirely successful. The C'tan were effectively gods by that point, and direct destruction was impossible. But they could be broken, shattered into fragments, each diminished by the fragmentation, each small enough to be contained within the tesseract labyrinths the Necrons had developed. The C'tan were imprisoned, reduced from gods to weapons that the Necrons could deploy in battle and then seal back in their boxes. Victory had come at a price that made victory feel indistinguishable from defeat. The galaxy was a ruin. The Necrons were not the people they had been when the war started, and the Silent King, overcome by what he had done, issued the final command: retreat. Enter the tomb worlds, sleep, wait for the galaxy to stabilize enough for a return. The Great Sleep lasted 60 million years. Most of the Necrons slept through all of it. One did not. Section 4. Trazyn before the metal, the archivist of flesh. Before the furnaces, before the necrodermis bodies and the green eyelights and the silent gliding forms of the legions, before all of that, there was a Necron tier, and his name was Trazyn, and his job was to remember. He was the chief archivist of his people, not the most glamorous position in Necrontyr society, not the most powerful, not the kind of role that earned the reverence that warriors and rulers commanded, but a position of genuine importance in a civilization obsessed with commemoration, that built enormous sepulchral monuments because its people died too young to feel comfortable about what happened to their memory after death. His role was to oversee the preservation of Necrontyr history, culture, and legacy, to manage the mummification of pharaohs, the process by which their rulers were preserved after death in forms suitable for ceremonial interment, to catalog the relics and artifacts that accumulated in a civilization that had been building things for long enough to produce substantial quantities of very old objects, to ensure that what had been was not lost. He was, in other words, a collector before he ever had a metal body to carry the impulse forward. The drive to preserve was not something that biotransference gave him, or something that emerged from the experience of metal existence. It was the shape of his personality before any of that, the organizing principle of what he did with his days, when days were composed of flesh and breath, and the ticking of a biological clock. He gathered things. He cataloged them. He gave them places in the record and ensured that the record was maintained. There is something quietly devastating about this when you sit with it for a moment. Trazyn was already, in his organic life, the person whose purpose was to hold against loss. He watched his people build things and die and leave those buildings behind, and his job was to be the one who gathered those buildings up in the form of records and objects and ensured they were not forgotten. He was the memory of a species that had precious little time to build memories, and he took that seriously. In whatever way a Necrontyr could take anything seriously, while also dying by inches from the radiation his homeworld star pumped into him daily. The question of how Trazyn entered biotransference is genuinely complicated by the lore's own internal contradictions, and these contradictions are themselves meaningful rather than simply being inconsistencies. Trazyn's own account, to the degree that he has one, given that he has installed memory protection protocols that prevent him from accessing most of his recollections of that period, suggests that he was forced into it, that he had no real choice, that the process was imposed on him against his will. Waaaagh the Diviner, who has the ability to review historical events directly through his chronomantic capabilities, and who has no particular motivation to be gentle with Trazyn's sense of self, maintains that this is false, that Trazyn went into the furnaces willingly, that he chose the immortality that was on offer, and then chose not to remember having chosen it. Both accounts are consistent with the character. Trazyn being forced would fit a narrative of victimhood that would excuse him from responsibility for the process he participated in. Trazyn choosing it and then installing amnesia to hide that choice from himself would fit something darker. A person who understood what he was agreeing to, agreed anyway, and found the fact of his agreement too uncomfortable to live with over the long run. The novel The Infinite and the Divine does not fully resolve this, but it suggests the latter interpretation. What we know is this: whatever his reasons, whatever his experience of the transition, Trazyn emerged from the biofurnaces with the drive to preserve intact. Not merely intact, amplified, perhaps, by the removal of everything else that had competed with it for priority. The grief that would have tempered his collecting impulse was muted. The social awareness that would have made him weigh other people's interests against his own was diminished. The emotional understanding of why taking things without permission was wrong was hollowed out, along with everything else that made the Necrontyr people rather than processes. But the drive itself, the deep conviction that things were worth keeping and that it was his purpose to keep them that survived the furnace, unchanged. He emerged on the other side of biotransference as a being whose entire identity was organized around a single, uncomplicated impulse, freed from the context that would have made it moral and from the constraints that would have made it reasonable. He was the archivist of a species that no longer technically existed, stripped of the flesh that had made him mortal and the emotional richness that had made him human. Left with the job and nothing else, he got to work. The war in heaven came, and the Necrons fought it, and the Satan were shattered, and the Silent King issued his command, and the Great Sleep began. Trazyn was supposed to enter stasis with the rest of them. He was supposed to sleep for 60 million years and participate in the Necrons' planned return to galactic dominance. He did not do this. Whether by malfunction, intention, or something that falls in the space between those categories, Trajan woke up early, significantly early. He woke into a galaxy that had been running without him for a span of time that should have been incomprehensible, and he found it full of interesting things that had not been there before. Things that had not existed 60 million years ago, civilizations that had risen and, in several cases, fallen, technologies he had never encountered, cultural artifacts of forms he had no prior frame of reference for, historical events of extraordinary significance, unfolding in real time without anyone paying the kind of attention they deserved. He made himself a pledge. He would share this collection with the rest of his race when they eventually awoke. He would be the one who had watched and recorded while they slept, the one who could give them the full picture of what had happened to the galaxy during their absence. He would be, in a sense, the collective memory of a species that had spent 60 million years with its eyes closed. In practice, this meant he needed to acquire things, a lot of things, and the galaxy, inconveniently, was not always willing to give them up voluntarily. Section 5. The Great Sleep and Waking Too Soon. 60 million years is a number that does not fit inside human consciousness without significant assistance. The Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Complex multicellular life has existed here for perhaps 600 million years. The first dinosaurs appeared roughly 230 million years ago, and the last non-avian dinosaurs were extinct approximately 66 million years ago. Modern humans, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, have been around for perhaps 300,000 years. Agriculture, cities, written records, everything we mean when we say civilization, span perhaps 12,000 years at most. The Necrons slept for 60 million years. They entered stasis before the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs struck the Earth. They were sleeping before the first fully human beings walked upright on the plains of Africa. They were in their tombs before any of the civilizations that human history is built on had been imagined, let alone built. During those 60 million years, the galaxy kept moving. The Eldari, one of the species created by the Old Ones as weapons during the war in heaven, rose to dominance over the galaxy and built a civilization of such extraordinary sophistication and psychic power that they genuinely could claim to be the galaxy's rulers. They held that position for millions of years. They created art and architecture and philosophy and culture that made even the finest human achievements look modest by comparison. They built the webway, a network of extra-dimensional tunnels threading through the galaxy that allowed faster-than-light travel without the hazards of the warp, whose engineering complexity was beyond anything any other species has produced before or since. And then they destroyed themselves, not quickly and not all at once, but through a process of social and spiritual decay that built over millennia an increasingly hedonistic culture that fed its emotional extremes directly into the warp, and, in doing so, nurtured something there that eventually grew too large and too hungry to be contained. The birth of Slaanesh, the chaos god of desire and excess, tore the heart out of the Eldari civilization in a single psychic catastrophe. Most of them died in the moment of Slaanesh's birth. The survivors scattered into craft worlds and dark corners of reality, diminished from galactic rulers to a remnant people trying to survive the consequences of what they had become. The humans rose in the aftermath of this, spread across the stars during what they would call the Dark Age of technology, building a civilization that spanned the galaxy and developed technologies that rivaled anything that had come before. And then lost most of it in the Age of Strife, another catastrophe, this one psychic in origin, as the warp destabilized in ways that made interstellar travel catastrophically unreliable. The galaxy fragmented. Human worlds lost contact with each other. Millennia passed. The Emperor of Mankind emerged from obscurity and began the work of reunification, the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy 10,000 years ago now, a wound that has never healed, and the long, grinding darkness of the 41st millennium, where an imperium of 1,000,000 worlds maintains its existence through faith and atrocity, and the sheer stubborn refusal to admit that things are getting worse. Trajan watched all of this. He was awake for it. He observed the Eldari at their height and their fall. He watched humanity build and lose and rebuild and lose again. He was present during the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade. He saw the Horus Heresy from a careful distance, cataloging the significance of its events with the same calm interest he brought to everything else. He understood that he was watching history remarkable, unrepeatable history, and that his job was to preserve what he could of it. The Aeldari civilizations produced art worth keeping. The various human empires that rose during the Age of Technology produced technologies worth keeping. The chaos of the Age of Strife produced specimens and artifacts worth keeping. Everything that happened was, from Trajan's perspective, potential material for the galleries, and he gathered it all with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be, and the specific focus of something that has only one real purpose. He made the promise when he first woke from the great sleep that he would share the collection with the rest of his race when they awoke. This promise has shaped every acquisition since. He is not collecting for himself, not exactly. He is collecting for an audience. He imagines a future in which the Necron race, restored to something like full consciousness and purpose, will walk through the galleries of Solemnace and encounter the 60 million years they missed. Will encounter the history of the galaxy that grew up while they slept. Will encounter all the things that were interesting and worth preserving that would otherwise have been lost in the fire of war and entropy and time. Whether this future is possible, whether the Necrons can ever be what he imagines they might be, these are questions he does not need to answer. He has eternity. He can wait. Section 6. The Galleries of Solemnace. The museum at the end of the galaxy. The Galleries of Solemnace are one of those things that require description in stages, because the whole of it is too large to take in at once, and the details are where the meaning lies. Start with the physical reality. A tomb world on the eastern fringe, unremarkable from the outside by deliberate design, whose underground galleries have been expanding for 60 million years through the labor of canoptech constructs that have been building continuously since the first exhibits were installed. The sheer volume of what is stored there is beyond any meaningful comparison. The greatest museums of human civilization occupy buildings measured in thousands of square meters. The Galleries of Solemnace occupy a space that, including the subdimensional reality bubble that Trajan has attached to the physical tomb via reality tethers, is effectively unlimited. He has not come close to filling it. He will not come close to filling it. But the direction of travel is toward fullness, exhibit by exhibit, acquisition by acquisition, over the long stretch of time he has available. The physical artifacts alone represent the single largest collection of historically significant material in the galaxy. Technologies from the Dark Age of Technology, the period before the Age of Strife, when human civilization was at its peak, sit alongside objects from the War in Heaven era. Aeldari cultural items from civilizations that predate the Aeldari's own fall. Pre-Necrontire alien artifacts from species that existed before the Necrontire were recognizable as a species. The layering of historical periods in the collection is so deep that the catalog, if printed in a form legible to human eyes, would fill more volumes than all the libraries of the Imperium combined. Consider what some of these objects mean. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the organization charged with maintaining and recovering the technological heritage of humanity, spends enormous resources trying to locate and retrieve standard template constructs, the pre-Age of Strife design documents, from which much of the Imperium's technology is derived. They treat old STC templates as sacred relics. They would sacrifice armies for an intact STC of sufficient quality. They mourn, in the specific quiet way that a religious organization mourns, the knowledge that was lost in the Age of Strife, the techniques and designs that were simply not written down or backed up in recoverable form before everything collapsed. Much of that knowledge, or at least physical examples of the things that knowledge produced, is in Solemnace. Trajan was watching during the period when human civilization was building those things. He found some of them interesting. He kept them. The Wraithbone Choir of Altanzar holds a place of prominence. Altanzar was an Aeldari craft world partially consumed by the Eye of Terror during the catastrophe of Slaaneish's birth. For 10,000 years, it was considered lost, its population assumed destroyed, its cultural heritage consumed by the warp. When Altanzar re-emerged during one of the periods of warp flux associated with the Black Crusades, much of what had made it distinctively Altanzar had been consumed or corrupted beyond recognition. The Wraithbone Choir, a structure of profound spiritual and artistic significance to Altanzar's people, survived in Trajan's collection, preserved perfectly, catalogued with the dry precision he applies to everything. The surviving Altansari would almost certainly consider its recovery a matter of paramount cultural importance. Trazen considers it a rather fine addition to the wing dedicated to Ealdari cultural heritage. The preserved head of Sebastian Thor is another exhibit whose significance demands unpacking. Thor was the single most important reformer in the history of the Ecclesiarchy, the organization that manages the religious worship of the god Emperor, since the Emperor himself walked among humanity. He ended the Age of Apostasy, a century-plus period of institutionalized religious violence and political corruption, during which the Ecclesiarchy was turned into an instrument of personal power and mass atrocity by the High Lord Vandir. Thor led the movement that removed Vandir and rebuilt the Ecclesiarchy into something at least nominally closer to its stated purpose. To the billions of the Imperium who venerate the Emperor through the lens of the Ecclesiarchy, Sebastian Thor is a figure of immense religious significance. His physical remains would be the most precious relic in the Ecclesiarchy's possession. His head is in a sealed preservation unit in Solemnace. No one in the Imperium knows this. The ossified husk of an enslaver is perhaps the most historically significant single exhibit in scientific terms, though it does not generate the same immediate gut punch as some others. Enslavers were warp predators that emerged during and after the War in Heaven. Beings that attached to the minds of psychically sensitive individuals used those minds as portals and rapidly overwhelmed any population they encountered. They came very close to depopulating the entire galaxy in the aftermath of the War in Heaven, and the sheer scale of the threat they represented was one of the primary reasons the Silent King ordered the Great Sleep. The galaxy was simply too dangerous. Enslavers no longer exist as an active threat in the 41st millennium. The husk in Trazen's collection may be the only physical specimen of an organism that once nearly ended all intelligent life in the galaxy. There is a complete Wraith Knight, an Ealdari war machine of enormous size and power, apparently captured intact. How Trazen managed to subdue and transport a Wraith Knight is a question the lore does not answer, probably because the answer would require Trazen to have done something deeply embarrassing to one of the Ealdari's most formidable weapons. But it is there. There is the Fulgrim clone, a perfect genetic copy of Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, preserved in stasis. The implications of a functional Primarch clone sitting in the galleries of Solemnis are substantial enough that the Warhammer community has been discussing them since this was first established in the lore. Primarch cloning technology that works. A copy of one of the 20 most significant figures in human military history, available for retrieval if anyone with sufficient access and sufficient motivation happened to know it was there. And the giant in Baroque power armor, enormous, beyond Space Marine proportions, clad in intricately decorated armor of an old pattern, face frozen in a permanent expression of suffering. This exhibit has generated more speculation than almost any other element of the collection, because the description is consistent with a very specific and very small category of beings. And if the exhibit is what the community suspects it might be, the implications are extraordinary. Trazen has not clarified. The label has not been shared. The mystery remains. And separately from all these individual objects, there is a full orc horde frozen in stasis mid-battle cry. An entire force of greenskins, paused in the moment of their most enthusiastic bellowing, faces arranged in expressions of pure combat ecstasy, preserved indefinitely in the depths of a Necron museum because someone found them interesting enough to keep. This is, in a capsule, the entire Trazen situation. Section 7. The Prismatic Galleries, where history is the exhibit. If the standard exhibits in the galleries of Solemnace represent the extraordinary, the prismatic galleries represent something that forces a direct confrontation with what preservation means when it is taken to its absolute, unconstrained, logical conclusion. The prismatic galleries are not collections of objects. They are collections of moments, and the moments are kept alive through the people who originally lived them. The exhibits in the prismatic galleries are composed of beings who have been transmuted into hard light, not killed and then recreated as projections, but converted their physical forms translated into a medium that is simultaneously the beings they were and a different state of being altogether, one that allows them to exist within the parameters of a display diorama and to be experienced by observers as though the moment the diorama depicts is occurring in real time. They move within their scenes. They interact within their scenes. They replay the historical moments they depict with an authenticity that Trazen finds superior to any reconstruction. They are conscious. The lore is clear about this. The beings in the prismatic galleries retain their awareness. They experience the moment of their capture, or something adjacent to it, in a state that the medium of hard light sustains indefinitely. They are not simply projections playing back a recording. There is something of the original person still present in the exhibit. The logistics of maintaining this are, from Trazen's perspective, a significant ongoing challenge. When a display is damaged by a malfunctioning Canoptech Wraith, by a ceiling collapse, by the catastrophic firefight with an Inquisitor that produced its own exhibit out of the survivors, the conscious beings who comprise that exhibit are gone, not recoverable. The moment they depicted cannot be reconstructed from the same source material, because the source material no longer exists. Trazen must find replacements. The Death of Lord Solar Macharius exhibit illustrates this particularly well. Macharius Warmaster, Lord Solar Macharius, the greatest imperial military commander in history between Horus and the modern era, the man who led the Macharian Crusade and conquered approximately 1,000 worlds in 7 years, died of illness, not in battle, after the Crusade's completion. His death was historically significant enough that Trazen found it worth memorializing. The exhibit is composed partly of beings who were present at the event. 1/10 of the figures in this exhibit are Imperial Guardsmen from 300 years in the wrong time period. Trazen needed to fill out the numbers and used what was available. The soldiers from the wrong era are wearing uniforms that do not match the period, carrying weapons that would not have been issued in Macharius's time, displaying rank insignia from a later system than the one in use during the Crusade. None of this particularly concerns Trazen. The spectacle is maintained, the commemorative intent is served. This approach, prioritizing the experience and the preservation over the precision, filling gaps with whatever fits close enough, treating the recreation as the point rather than the recreation's exactness, is very much of a piece with how Trazen approaches preservation generally. He is a curator in the sense of someone who wants the gallery to be full and compelling and organized in a way that conveys meaning, and who is willing to compromise on accuracy in service of those goals. The exhibit labeled The Massacres on Tragus, an orc warband attacking an unknown blue-shelled invertebrate species that appears in no other Necron records, and may represent the sole surviving evidence that this species ever existed. A temporal device containing a Tyranid invasion that Trazen himself apparently instigated for the purpose of capturing Tyranid representatives for display, only to eventually abandon the exhibit after multiple full-scale battles, resulted from Tyranid breakouts, demonstrating definitively that Tyranids are not well suited to static museum conditions. An exhibit labeled Last Stand of Ursarkar Creed. The person this exhibit commemorates was, at the time of its creation, still alive. The label had been prepared in advance. Whether this represents predictive technology, long-term planning, a deep understanding of historical trajectories, or simply the confidence of someone who has been watching the universe long enough to know where things are going, is another of those questions Trazen has not felt moved to explain. What is most disturbing about the prismatic galleries is not that they exist, or even that they are composed of conscious beings against their will. It is that they represent what Trazen considers care. He has gone to enormous lengths to ensure that these moments are not lost. He has invested resources and planning and genuine intellectual effort into making sure that these pieces of history are preserved in a form that can be experienced, not merely archived as data. The horror of the prismatic galleries is inseparable from the sincerity behind them. He is not tormenting these people for the pleasure of it. He is preserving them because he genuinely believes that preservation is worth any cost, and has never once seriously entertained the question of whether the things being preserved might have opinions about the process. This is not cruelty in the sense of malice. It is cruelty in the sense of complete, totalizing indifference to the desires of the material being processed. The artifacts have no wishes that Trazen needs to consider, and the people who constitute those artifacts are, to him, indistinguishable from the artifacts themselves. He is not a monster. He is something worse than a monster. He is a curator. Section 8. The greatest acquisitions, Trazen's most remarkable heists. Understanding Trajan's character requires understanding the pattern of his acquisitions, not just what he has collected, but how, and what the process of collection reveals about the way he thinks and the priorities he has established over 60 million years of practice. His preference is for proxy operations. He sends agents. He uses mind-shackle scarabs, tiny mechanical constructs that burrow into a being's nervous system and rewrite their decision-making to turn other beings into unwitting asset transferors. He deploys the Acquisition Phalanx, a specialized formation of elite Lich Guard whose entire operational purpose is to secure objects of interest during military engagements. When wars break out, and wars break out constantly in the 41st millennium, Trajan sees opportunities. Not military opportunities, not political opportunities, but collecting opportunities. If two factions are destroying each other over a world that contains something he wants, Trajan will often involve himself in the conflict to ensure the thing he wants survives, rather than being lost in the chaos. This occasionally produces the paradoxical situation of Trajan's forces saving something that would otherwise have been destroyed, which makes him, by accident, a preservationist in the most literal sense. The case of Inquisitor Valeria is instructive. Valeria was a Xeno-scavenger Inquisitor, a figure operating on the more flexible end of the Inquisition spectrum, willing to engage with alien civilizations and artifacts in ways that more orthodox colleagues would have found heretical. She mounted an expedition to Solemnace, a genuinely difficult and dangerous undertaking, as Solemnace does not advertise its location, and its tomb defenses are formidable. The expedition reached its destination at the cost of most of its members. Valeria explored as much as she could, found the galleries impenetrable to her attempts to extract anything, and left empty-handed. Sometime afterward, she received a personal communication from Trajan, a hyperscroll message, transmitted through channels a Necron overlord should not technically have access to, thanking her for sending her escort regiments, the Katachan jungle fighters who had accompanied the expedition, to add to his galleries. They had been captured during the expedition's journey through the outer tomb areas without any of the survivors being aware it was happening. The message was accompanied by a gift, a tesseract labyrinth, described as a particularly fine example of a specific construction style. The gift was, in Trajan's framing, a gesture of collegiality towards someone he found interesting. In the framing of anyone familiar with what tesseract labyrinths do, they are pocket-dimensional prison devices. It was an armed trap. Whether Valeria escaped it or became another exhibit in the galleries is something the lore deliberately leaves ambiguous. Trajan appears to have genuinely liked her, in whatever attenuated sense of liking is available to him. He refers to their pen-pal correspondence with something that sounds like nostalgia. He was reportedly annoyed when he learned she had been eliminated by another Inquisitor before he could arrange a follow-up meeting. The two attempts to acquire the Spear of Vulcan are worth noting, because they represent the rare cases where Trajan went personally after something and came away without it. The Spear of Vulcan is an ancient relic of the Salamander's Space Marine chapter, one of the artifacts known as the Artifacts of Vulcan, which the chapter seeks as part of their founding traditions. Forgefather Vulcan Heastan, the Salamander's master of the chapter's relics, is their primary guardian. Trajan wanted the spear. He went after it himself in 878 of the 41st millennium and was defeated in direct combat by Heastan. He tried again during the Tok'ran Crusade in 943 and was thwarted a second time. These failures are notable because they are failures. Trajan does not often fail when he commits to an acquisition, and the Spear of Vulcan represents one of the very few cases where something he wanted remained definitively out of reach. Whether he has abandoned this particular ambition or is simply waiting for the right moment is not established in the lore. Both possibilities feel consistent with his character. The Tanith situation is one that deserves extended discussion, because it is simultaneously one of the most remarkable things in Trajan's collection and one of the most poignant. The first and only regiment commanded by the beloved character Ibram Gaunt, the subject of Dan Abnett's long-running series, are the survivors of the destroyed world of Tanith. The planet was consumed by chaos before most of its people could evacuate, leaving the regiment as the only survivors, a fact that defines their identity, drives their narrative, and has been the source of their specific grief throughout decades of fiction. They are the last of Tanith. The weight of that lastness is real and constant, and has shaped everything about who they are as a unit. Trazyn has multiple regiments of Tanith soldiers in stasis. He collected them before the planet's destruction. The people that the ghosts have spent their entire military careers mourning as gone are preserved, alive, in the galleries of solemnness. None of the surviving ghosts know this. Gaunt has no idea. The grief that has shaped everything about the first and only is, in a deeply strange way, based on a loss that did not entirely happen in the way they understand it to have happened. The people they are mourning are not dead. They are simply in a museum in the Eastern Fringe, with no prospect of release, unless someone with access to solemnness and sufficient motivation happens to find them. This is, in capsule form, the entire Trazyn moral situation. He preserved the Tanith. In a galaxy where worlds are routinely destroyed without anyone bothering to save anything, in a setting where the default outcome for a culture that is in the wrong place when something terrible happens is total and complete loss, the fact that multiple Tanith regiments exist and are intact is genuinely remarkable. He saved them. He also imprisoned them without their consent, separated them permanently from the lives they would have lived, and ensured that the people who love them have spent decades grieving over losses that did not need to be losses. Both things are completely and equally true. Neither cancels the other out. Welcome to Trazyn. The collection of the Tanith is not unique in this structure. The Skitarii Codex documents a case where Trazyn captured several tech priests, evacuating during a Necron invasion of their world, and preserved them as a commemorative installation dedicated to the planet's fall. He has reportedly captured various Imperial Guard regiments, Aldari cultural representatives of various alien species that had the misfortune of being interesting at a moment when Trazyn was in their vicinity, and several beings whose identities remain classified under the label of their exhibit without further elaboration. The scope of what has been gathered makes the mind reach for metaphors and find all of them insufficient. It is the largest museum ever assembled, staffed by one person with occasionally questionable taste and absolutely no ethical limitations on its growth, focused on a subject matter galactic history that encompasses every civilization that has ever existed, and it has been in operation since before anything alive today was born. Section 9. The Eternal Rivalry, Trazyn, and Orkan, the Diviner. In a story full of ancient things, the rivalry between Trazyn the Infinite and Orkan the Diviner stands out for its particular quality of antiquity. Not because it is older than everything else, it is not, in galactic terms, but because it is ancient and active, ancient and personal, ancient in a way that has accumulated enough specific incidents, enough documented betrayals and counter-betrayals, enough specific arguments over specific objects, to feel genuinely lived rather than merely long. They were rivals before biotransference. The court archivist and the court astrologer, two specialists whose domains were adjacent enough to occasionally overlap and sufficiently different that their approaches to overlapping territory were guaranteed to conflict. Trazyn preserves the past. Orkan predicts and, in his more ambitious moments, attempts to shape the future. He is a chronomancer, a master of temporal magic and astronomical prediction, capable of calculating the future from the patterns of the stars and, to a limited degree, of rewinding time to change outcomes he finds unfavorable. Where Trazyn's obsession is with what has already happened, Orkan's is with what is going to happen, and how to ensure that what happens is what he predicted it would be. Orkan's wields the Staff of Tomorrow, a weapon that exists slightly ahead of linear time, allowing him to strike before his target moves. He is not a straightforward opponent. He is the kind of being who will reset a hostile situation 47 times to find the one arrangement in which he achieves a favorable outcome, and who has no particular compunction about the other 46 attempts. He was, before biotransference, the court astronomer who warned against the biotransference process, who calculated that its outcome would be catastrophic, and said so, loudly, to people who did not want to hear it. The fact that he was right and everyone ignored him has not made him gracious in the millennia since. Orkan and Trazyn are, by the standards of Necron society, about as different as two beings who share the same fundamental nature can be. Where Trazyn looks backward, collects the past, preserves history, builds a museum of what was, Orkan looks forward. Both orientations are, in their way, responses to the same thing, the loss of the emotional richness that biotransference stripped from the Necron tier. Trazyn fills the absence by keeping things. Oricon fills it by controlling things, by ensuring that outcomes align with his predictions, that the future he calculated is the future that occurs. Both are, in their different ways, reaching for certainty in a universe that has given their species every reason to distrust certainty. The Astrarium Mysterios is what escalated their existing low-level animosity into something that lasted 10,000 years and destroyed at least one world along the way. The artifact, an object encoding a star map to the stasis tomb of Nephrith, a legendary Necron-tier pharaon from the pre-biotransference era, represented different things to each of them. For Oricon, it was the key to knowledge that might allow the reversal of biotransference, the restoration of organic life to the Necrons, the chance to undo the worst thing that ever happened to his species. He had warned against biotransference. The possibility of undoing it was the closest thing to vindication available. For Trazyn, the artifact was rare and interesting, and already in his collection, and Oricon had stolen it, which was the part that immediately mattered. Their motivations, characteristically, operated at completely different scales. Oricon's was civilizational, Trazyn's was personal, while producing an identical practical outcome. Both of them wanted the artifact, and neither was willing to concede. The world of Serenade was their battlefield. A world with a history, originally an Exodite Ildari colony, then colonized by humans after the Exodites were displaced, then burned by Exterminatus during the rivalry's most consequential phase, then a dead world with a living tomb beneath its scorched crust. The tomb of Nephrith lay beneath Serenade's surface, accessible only when specific celestial alignments occurred, conditions that manifested only every few centuries or millennia. The waiting was not a hardship for either of them. They had the time. What neither of them had was the capacity to stop wanting what the other one also wanted, which is perhaps the defining characteristic of their relationship across the entire span of their rivalry. Serenade itself had a feature that the lore makes a point of describing: a signal, a continuous numeric broadcast emanating from the depth of Nephrith's tomb, a repeating sequence: 3, 2, 1, 1, 1, 5, 4, 5, 4, 1, 3, 1, 5, 3, 2, 2. Infinite and incessant, that permeated the local psychic environment and subtly influenced the mental state of every being who lived on Serenade long enough to be exposed to it. Generations of inhabitants were shaped, without knowing it, by this signal. Their culture, their decision-making, their social structures were affected in ways that are difficult to quantify but visible in the historical record. For Necrons who investigated the signal closely enough, the risk was instability in their own neural systems. Both Trazyn and Oricon found this interesting for different reasons. They were each, in their way, studying the same world from different angles, and neither was inclined to share their research with the other. Trazyn, at some point in the long stretch of this conflict, made a decision that illustrates both his pettiness and his capacity for spectacularly miscalculated practical jokes. He wanted Oricon out of the competition. He chose to achieve this by releasing a single Genestealer into the deep caverns below Serenade's surface, with the intention that it would find and kill Oricon during one of his investigative expeditions. The Genestealer did not kill Oricon. Oricon fought it off, and it escaped. And then, because this is how Genestealers work, it survived, reproduced, and over the course of centuries, built a Genestealer cult of such size and organizational sophistication that when it finally surfaced and launched its coordinated uprising, the Imperium had no good options for dealing with it. Exterminatus, the complete destruction of a world's surface biosphere via orbital bombardment. The most severe and irreversible response in the Imperium's military toolkit, used here because Trazyn made a passive-aggressive move in a private rivalry, and the consequences metastasized beyond any reasonable anticipation. Oricon spent over 100 years buried in the ruins of a dead world, slowly digging himself out. He has held this against Trazyn with a persistence that suggests he considers it one of the more unforgivable items on a very long list, which is saying something given how long that list has been accumulating. The rivalry eventually forced both of them into what amounts to the Necron equivalent of small claims court, an actual formal proceeding before the Awakened Council, where they were both brought up on charges related to the destruction they had caused. The proceeding is rendered with wonderful deadpan humor in Robert Rath's novel, two impossibly ancient beings arguing about salvage rights and technicalities in a cosmic courtroom, each deploying legal strategies that reflect everything that is wrong with them as individuals. They were eventually forced by circumstances to cooperate twice. The first time, when the Exterminatus accelerated the timeline for accessing the tomb. The second time, when they discovered that the tomb contained not the knowledge they sought, but a Cetan shard of the Deceiver, the entity responsible, millennia ago, for engineering the Necrontier's initial approach to the Cetan, for crafting the manipulation that led to biotransference, for the specific flavor of catastrophe that defined the Necron species' entire history. The Cetan had been sending the signal. The signal was not a map, it was a lure. The god wanted out of its prison, and had spent thousands of years calling for someone clever enough and stubborn enough to come open the door. Trazyn and Oricon are, among the beings of the Eastern Fringe, perhaps the two most qualified for that description. And they delivered. And then, they had to deal with what they had delivered. What followed in Robert Rath's novel is one of the great set pieces of Black Library fiction. Two ancient enemies who have spent thousands of years trying to get the better of each other, forced into desperate alliance against a god. Trazyn deployed the full resources of his collection in sequence. Hive fleet against Genestealer cult, Imperial regiments against Necron warriors, layer upon layer of violence directed at a divine being. The cost was enormous. The damage to the collection was catastrophic. Exhibits that had been assembled over thousands of years were unleashed and lost in the battle. And when Oricon, through a process that involved the Aldari gemstone they had found on Serenade and abilities that pushed to the outer limits of chronomantic power, achieved a transcendent state and shattered the Cetan shard, what remained was a different landscape. A victory, a debt between rivals that neither fully acknowledged, and Oricon swearing renewed vengeance, because some things about their relationship are simply fixed. The Wicked and the Warped, the long-awaited sequel announced in 2025, brings these two back together in the post-Great Rift galaxy. The dynamic continues. Their mutual exasperation and covert respect continue to deepen. The galaxy suffers the consequences of their reunion, and the readers benefit from it. What makes the Trazyn-Oricon relationship one of the best things in Warhammer fiction is not the spectacle of their clashes, though those are genuinely enjoyable. It is what their interaction reveals about both characters. Oricon brings out Trazyn's pettiness and his strange capacity for genuine investment in things that matter to him. Trazyn brings out Oricon's suppressed need for someone to talk to who is capable of understanding him. Two beings who have both lost almost everything that made them alive, finding in their mutual hatred something that functions in a broken and deeply problematic way, almost like connection. It is the Warhammer 40,000 version of a long friendship that neither party will admit is a friendship. The unlikely hero Trazyn on Cadia. Of all the moments in Trazyn's long history that could be described as surprising, his involvement in the fall of Cadia stands apart. Not because Trazyn doing unexpected things is unusual, he does unexpected things constantly, and has for 60 million years. But because what he did at Cadia came closest to something that most beings in the galaxy would recognize as heroism, even if his motivations for doing it were entirely characteristic, and his methods were exactly what you would expect from someone whose relationship with ethics has never been particularly warm. The context: the 13th Black Crusade. Abaddon the Despoiler, the Chaos Warlord who has led 12 previous crusades from the Eye of Terror and been repeatedly thwarted, mounted what was intended to be his final, decisive campaign against the fortress world of Cadia. Cadia held a unique strategic position it sat, at the closest stable exit point from the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift that Chaos used as its staging ground, and the Necron-built pylons that dotted its surface suppressed warp activity in the surrounding area, keeping the Eye from expanding and limiting the power available to Chaos forces operating in the region. Taking Cadia was not merely a military objective for Abaddon, it was a symbolic and strategic necessity for the forces of Chaos. If Cadia fell, the pylons would fail, the Eye of Terror would expand, and the Imperium would face a threat it was not equipped to contain. The Black Crusade was, in essence, everything that had been building for 10,000 years of chaos assaults on the fortress world arriving at its final, decisive expression. Trazyn was watching from Solemnus, and he had a problem. His collection was being disrupted. The Bell of St. Gerstal, a sacred relic of the ecclesiarchy that Trazyn had acquired at some point and housed in his galleries, rang 13 times by itself, not as a result of any action by Trazyn or his systems. It rang on its own, 13 dolorous strikes that caused escalating structural damage to the galleries before Trazyn dealt with it in the most efficient manner available to him. He threw it into the webway. This solved the immediate problem with minimal ceremony and maximum practicality. The bell's ringing was, according to certain prophecies, connected to the opening of what the prophecy called the Eye of Darkness for the last time, which suggested to anyone paying attention to the state of the galaxy that something significant was happening at the Eye of Terror's margin. Trazyn consulted the Celestial Orrery, an ancient Necron device of extraordinary capability that can display the state of the galaxy in remarkable detail, and confirmed that the root cause of his collection's disruption was the pressure building at Cadia. The planetary conflict there was approaching a scale whose consequences would propagate throughout the galaxy in ways that would be bad for everyone, including collectors with vested interests in the galaxy remaining full of interesting things to collect. He also realized, because he had been watching human civilization for 10,000 years, and had been present when the Cadian pylons were originally erected as part of the Cetan's grand design to close off the warp from the material universe, that he understood how to use them. The Imperial defenders on Cadia had been living alongside Necron technology for millennia without being able to fully operate it. Trazyn had the knowledge that they lacked. He went to Cadia. He did so without announcing himself characteristic, disguised in a scaled cloak that apparently functioned well enough to allow him to move through Imperial defensive infrastructure without immediate identification. He addressed specific problems as they arose, covertly supplying power to the planetary shield network when it was failing, positioning himself near the systems that would need activation when the moment came. When Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call needed to understand how the pylons functioned to their full potential, Trazyn revealed himself to Call and provided the knowledge. This moment, two beings who each operate at a level of complexity that most people around them cannot quite follow, recognizing each other as peers, is one of the better exchanges in the Gathering Storm narrative. They are not friends. They are not allies in any conventional sense. But they are equals in the specific way that two beings who understand something that nobody else understands can be equal. When the battle in the underground catacombs reached its most desperate point, when Abaddon himself led the assault, and the Imperial defenders were failing, Trazyn deployed assets from his collection. He opened Tesseract labyrinths. He released what amounted to an impromptu army, composed of historical Imperial forces drawn from different eras, regiments of Heresy-era Ultramarines, Vostroyans from a period several centuries past, Tanith soldiers, Salamanders, a Custodes guard, and the Puritan Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax alongside her Tempestus scions. Greyfax is worth a moment's consideration here. She had been Trazyn's prisoner for centuries. He had implanted mind-shackle scarabs in her nervous system to prevent her from harming him. He released her in the middle of a battle against chaos, not because he had decided to free her as a gesture of goodwill, but because the battle required more bodies on the Imperial side, and she was convenient and capable. She emerged from imprisonment, ready to fight, and she fought effectively, furiously, with the intensity of someone who has been waiting for a long time to be useful again. She also repeatedly tried to shoot Trazyn. The mind-shackle scarabs prevented her each time. She was fully aware they were preventing her. He was fully aware she was trying. The battle continued around this particular dynamic, without either party finding it sufficiently remarkable to pause and address. This is, in miniature, the texture of their entire relationship. The pylons, activated through Trazyn's knowledge and Call's engineering capability, functioned, briefly, magnificently. They suppressed the warp's connection to the surrounding space, cutting the chaos forces off from the full manifestation of their power, even causing the Eye of Terror to begin, imperceptibly, to contract. Abaddon retreated from the planet's surface in response. The Battle of the Elysian Fields was, technically, won. Abaddon then used the severely damaged remains of the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity as an improvised kinetic impactor and drove it into the planet's surface. Cadia died. The pylon network was destroyed. The Eye of Terror began to expand unchecked, eventually tearing the galaxy in half along what became the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift. The consequences of the planet's fall cascaded through the galaxy in ways that are still unfolding in current lore. And Trazyn, in the chaos of the final evacuation, made his decision about what he was going to keep. He had spent the battle with one eye on the situation and one eye on his Tesseract labyrinths, by his own internal accounting. He had hoped to claim Abaddon had genuinely, calculatingly wanted the War Master of Chaos as the centerpiece of a new exhibit, the would-be destroyer of civilization preserved in perpetuity, as a historical footnote, and had been denied this prize by Abaddon's escape. His second choice was, in terms of historical significance, arguably a superior acquisition. Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, the greatest military mind Cadia had produced in 10,000 years. The man who had held the fortress world together through the entire Black Crusade, through a combination of tactical brilliance and the specific stubbornness that comes from being the last person standing between something terrible, everything you care about. He was organizing the evacuation of survivors when Trazyn found him, making sure others escaped before himself, dying on his feet. According to the accounts that exist of this encounter, Trazyn extended his hand. He said, in essence, "This is not your end. Eternity awaits." He used a Tesseract labyrinth to collect the Lord Castellan of Cadia. The exhibit was labeled, Last Stand of Ursarkar Creed. The label had been prepared in advance. Creed's fate was one of the most discussed mysteries in the Warhammer community for years after this event. He had not been shown dying. Characters who are not shown dying in Warhammer are often revealed to have not died in interesting ways. When it was eventually confirmed that Trazyn had collected Creed in a Tesseract labyrinth, that Creed was in the collection, alive, preserved, maintained in the galleries of Solemnace, the community reaction was a mixture of relief and exasperation that is perhaps the most accurate emotional response available to the situation. He is fine in the sense that he is not dead. He is not fine in the sense that he is in a jar. This is the Trazyn situation in its most crystalline form. He saved someone who would have died. He did so through methods that the saved person would certainly not have chosen. He prevented a loss. He created a different loss. He behaved, throughout, exactly as he always behaves, and the result is simultaneously better and worse than either simple outcome would have been. After Cadia, Trazyn teleported away with his acquisitions. The planet continued dying behind him. The galaxy continued changing as a consequence of the events he had participated in. And somewhere in the depths of Solemnace, a new exhibit was installed, its occupant unaware that the world he had spent his life defending no longer existed. Section 11. The Philosophy of the Collector. Why does Trazyn do this? Everything we have discussed has been moving, gradually, toward a question that the lore raises but never completely resolves, and that the best Warhammer fiction about Trazyn keeps circling with careful, appreciative restraint. The question is not what Trazyn does, we have covered that extensively. The question is why, in a deeper sense than the surface-level obsessiveness that drives any dedicated collector. What is he reaching for? What does he believe preservation accomplishes that justifies the methods he uses to achieve it? The surface answer is the one Trazyn himself would probably give, in whatever fragment of a conversation he would spare for such a philosophical inquiry. He preserves because the alternative is loss, and loss is the worst thing. The galaxy is a machine for destroying things, an engine of entropy that consumes civilizations and moments and people with equal indifference, and he is the one being who has the capability and the commitment to stand against that destruction and insist that some fraction of what exists should continue to exist. He does it because it is his purpose. The thing he was before the furnaces, the thing that survived the furnaces, the organizing principle of his existence that nothing has managed to dislodge in 60 million years. That answer is true, but not complete. The deeper answer requires consideration of what biotransference did to Trazyn specifically. The Necrons lost their emotional richness, the depth of inner life that made their experiences meaningful in the full sense. They retained their intellect and their skills and their functional personas, but they lost the warmth that connected all those things to something that felt, from the inside, like being someone rather than performing someone. Trazyn lost this, along with everyone else. But he also had something to fill the space that loss created. He had the drive to collect, the purpose of preservation, the structural role of being the one who remembered. These things were so deeply embedded in who he was that they survived the stripping process. And in the absence of the emotional context that would have made them operate normally, would have given them proportion and compassion and the awareness of other people's interests as a real countervailing force, they expanded to fill the entire available space. He collects because he cannot feel loss in the way he once could. The grief that would have connected him emotionally to the significance of what he preserved is attenuated beyond recognition, but the impulse to keep things from being gone that persists. It became the whole of him, because it was the one thing that survived substantially intact. He fills the galleries because the galleries are the only way he still has of insisting that things matter, of acting as though preservation is worth the cost, of performing the function of caring about loss, even when the felt experience of caring has been largely removed. There is an additional layer, surfaced with particular sensitivity, in the infinite and the divine. Trazyn has installed memory protection protocols that prevent him from accessing his memories of his mortal life. He cannot remember who he was before the medal. He does not know what his emotional inner life felt like, cannot access the specific texture of grief or joy or connection that would have been available to him as a flesh and blood being. He has deliberately sealed that part of himself away, but he kept objects from that time. Among the things in his collection, not the public displays, but the private possessions, the things that were his before any of this began, there was a walking cane topped with a hawk head handle, a personal object, something from the life before, a material connection to the self he cannot remember. He could not access the memories, but he kept the object. As though some part of him understood that the object might be the key to the memories if he ever decided he was ready to try the lock. When Waaaagh destroyed that cane deliberately, as an act of aggression during one of their conflicts, Trazyn's response was something that stood out from his usual calculated effect. He was furious in the way that a person is furious, when something irreplaceable is gone, when the loss is not merely material, but touches something deeper, that the lost object was the only physical remaining trace of. He was furious in the way of someone who still has, somewhere beneath everything the furnaces took, enough of themselves left to understand what it means to lose something that cannot be replaced. That fury tells you something important about what is still in there. The collection is also, according to the most sympathetic interpretation of his character, a form of communication, a message. He made the promise when he woke early from the great sleep, "I will share this with my people when they awaken." The gallery is not built for himself, alone. It is built for an audience he cannot yet reach. Every exhibit is addressed, in some sense, to the Necrons, still sleeping in their tombs, a letter written across 60 million years, explaining what they missed, showing them what grew up while they were absent. Come see what happened while you slept. I kept it for you. I kept all of it. This is, when you look at it from that angle, a kind of love. An attenuated, context-free, methodologically catastrophic kind of love that has caused significant harm to a large number of people who were unfortunate enough to be historically interesting at the wrong moment. But love directed at his species, at the collective of beings who share his specific tragedy, who went through the same furnaces and emerged diminished, and who deserve, when they wake, to have someone who paid attention to what they missed. His relationship with the humans he encounters is one of the places where his character reveals its most interesting dimensions. He finds them fascinating, not in a purely taxonomic way, not simply as specimens, but with something approaching genuine intellectual appreciation for what they have built and continue to build under conditions that should prevent it. He has noted, in various accounts, that every human world he has visited has produced something worth recording. He sees in humans the echo of the Necron, another people who built defiantly against a time limit, whose achievements were all the more remarkable for being accomplished by beings who knew they were temporary. He does not tell them this. He observes. He catalogs. And occasionally, when they are sufficiently remarkable, he keeps them. This is, in the deepest register, the tragedy and the wonder of Trazyn. He is a being who was made to care about the past, and then had most of his capacity to feel what caring felt like removed from him. What he is left with is the motion of caring, the behavior of caring, the outputs of a caring-shaped engine running on something other than actual feeling. And in 60 million years of producing those outputs, he has built something that the full-feeling version of himself might have been proud of if he could access enough of the original feelings to know what pride felt like in his own skin. Section 12. Trazyn's powers and his role in the current galaxy. The physical reality of what Trazyn is and the specific capabilities he possesses illuminate aspects of his character that more abstract analysis sometimes misses. He is not simply a philosophical entity. He is a specific being with specific tools deployed in specific situations, and understanding those tools helps understand the being. His body is a Necron overlord form at its base, but it is not standard in any way that matters. 60 million years of existence in necrodermis, combined with his intellectual obsession with biological life, have produced a form that incorporates refinements derived from studying every species he has encountered with sufficient thoroughness. The dissection of Vuzalan arachtoid compound eyes gave him improved optical targeting arrays. Molecular analysis of amble hide led to more efficient armor plating. The body of the galaxy's greatest collector is itself, in a sense, a collection, a compendium of biological insights expressed in living metal, each improvement a trophy of study and application. His primary weapon, the empathic obliterator, is named and designed with a precision that reflects his approach to everything. It is a staff, a weapon for single strikes rather than sustained engagement, for precise application of force rather than the sustained aggression of someone who enjoys fighting. When it kills a target, it releases a psionic shockwave that propagates through the mental bonds, connecting the target to nearby beings of similar purpose. The bonds between warriors, the solidarity and shared intent that makes a unit function as a unit rather than as individuals, become the transmission medium for the weapon's effect. An entire squad can be eliminated by a single blow to one of them, the connection itself becoming the vector for destruction. This suits Trazyn's combat preference exactly. He disdains extended physical confrontation with beings he considers inferior, which is most beings. He wants fights to end quickly and decisively, ideally before they require sustained personal attention. The empathic obliterator is a weapon for someone who has other things to do and finds combat an irritating interruption, a scholar's weapon, a curator's weapon, efficient enough to be worth using and elegant enough to be worth carrying. The Mindshackle scarabs are, in terms of their effect on everything around him, among his most important tools. Tiny mechanical constructs that burrow into a being's nervous system and rewrite their decision-making. They turn the beings they infect into agents who serve Trazyn's interests, without necessarily knowing they are doing so, or without being able to do otherwise, even when they know exactly what has been done to them. They are not subtle. They are an absolutely direct form of control, but Trazyn deploys them with a lightness of touch that suggests he does not think of what he is doing as control, more as arrangement. He arranges the beings around him into configurations that serve his purposes, using whatever tools are appropriate to each configuration. The surrogate host capability is perhaps his most personally significant power, because it speaks directly to how he has arranged his own continuity across 60 million years. He cannot be killed in any permanent sense. Destroy his primary body, and his consciousness is already downloaded and waiting in one of the prepared hosts he has distributed among his Leechguard, his lords, his cryptex. The host body adapts when his consciousness arrives, its own personality becoming dormant, the body physically reshaping itself to resemble Trazyn's usual form. He wakes up in a new body, his continuity unbroken, and carries on. He calls himself the Infinite in part because of this. He has not died, in any meaningful sense, since biotransference. He has had bodies destroyed. He has experienced the transition to new bodies, which he describes as jarring and inconvenient rather than particularly unpleasant. But he has not experienced the end that the Necrontyr lived in constant proximity to, that drove them to the desperate deal that unmade them. The irony of this is not lost on him. He is the archivist of a people who were desperate to live longer, and he lives and lives and lives, and the experience of that living is something he cannot fully compare to anything, because the standard of comparison what mortal life felt like from the inside, what death's proximity did to the texture of experience, is sealed away behind protocols he installed himself. In the current galaxy, following the fall of Cadia and the formation of the Great Rift, Trazyn has been operating in a substantially changed environment. The galaxy, split by the Cicatrix Maledictum, presents both obstacles. Travel between the galaxy's halves is complicated by warp instability and opportunities. New historical events of extraordinary significance are unfolding in real time, more rapidly than at almost any other point in the 10,000 years he has been watching. There is more to gather, more to preserve, more to add to the galleries. He has been interrogating the Satan shard he captured at the conclusion of the Infinite and the Divine's events. A diminished fragment of a god that predates most of the observable universe, even imprisoned, even fragmented, even held in a tesseract labyrinth in the depths of Solemnace, represents a source of knowledge that no other accessible entity can match. The Satan were present at the beginning of things. They remember, in whatever form Satan memory takes, the shape of the universe before most of what exists in it had been made. Trazyn is using this resource with characteristic methodicality and without particular concern for the shard's preferences about being interrogated. The return of the Silent King Sarek represents another factor in his current situation. Sarek has returned from his self-imposed exile bearing a project, the reversal of biotransference, the restoration of organic life to the Necron race. The attempt to undo, to whatever extent is possible, across 60 million years of metallic existence, what the Satan did to his people with the Necrontier's own complicity. Sarek has reached out to Trazyn in the course of pursuing this project, making an argument that a person who has been studying biological life for 60 million years might have insights relevant to restoring it. The archivist of the Necrontier might be the key to making something Necrontier adjacent possible again. Whether Trazyn will commit to this in any sustained way is an open question. His track record with sustained commitment to projects that serve other people's agendas is not encouraging. But the possibility of genuine investment is there, because if any objective could cut through his fundamental detachment and engage something real in him, it would be something that promised to answer the question. His self-installed amnesia has prevented him from accessing for 60 million years. What was it like to be the person he was before the furnace? What did the archivist feel when he was feeling it, when the things he preserved had the texture of meaning rather than the shape of it? The answer might be somewhere in the tombs he has been raiding, and the specimens he has been capturing, and the history he has been preserving. He might have been building toward the answer to his own most personal question without realizing it, or perhaps he has known all along, and the collecting has always been, at some unacknowledged level, a search for the self he cannot remember. Section 13. The meaning of the museum. Why Trazyn matters to Warhammer 40,000. Let us step back from the specific lore for a moment and talk about what Trazyn the Infinite actually does for the Warhammer 40,000 setting as a narrative and thematic entity, because this is worth articulating even if you came here primarily for the lore rather than the analysis. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting that is, at its core, about the horror of stasis, an imperium that has stopped moving forward and instead burns anything that suggests movement. A galaxy where progress is treated as heresy, and the greatest achievement of any given generation is to preserve what the previous generation left them, degraded and incomplete. A universe where things are always getting worse, where entropy is winning, where the candle of civilization flickers against an encroaching dark that has been encroaching since before anyone alive can remember. Into this setting, Trazyn drops a peculiar counterpoint, not an optimistic one. He is not optimistic in any conventional sense, but a strange, sideways refusal. He is the being who refuses to let things disappear. Who insists, against all evidence that insisting is reasonable, that the past deserves to be preserved? Who has spent longer than human civilization has existed, collecting the scraps of a galaxy that keeps trying to burn itself down? And who has not given up, and who has not become corrupted, and who has not decided that preservation is pointless because entropy wins eventually anyway? His methods are terrible. His ethics are non-functional. His relationship with consent is, as we have established, roughly equivalent to his relationship with the concerns of the pottery. But the impulse beneath the methods is something recognizable. And in recognizing it, you recognize something about him that is genuinely human, in a setting full of humans who have largely forgotten how to be. He is also proof that the Necrons are more than machines. This is perhaps his most important narrative function. The Necrons have historically been difficult to make sympathetic as a faction, because the basic concept, emotionless metal soldiers whose operational goal is the extinction of biological life, does not lend itself to the kind of nuanced engagement that makes fictional factions compelling. The older versions of the Necron lore leaned heavily into this, portraying them as essentially robotic drones with no meaningful inner life. The newer lore, which Trazyn has been central to developing, tells a different story. These are people diminished, transformed, hollowed out, to varying degrees, by the worst thing that ever happened to them. But people. They have obsessions and rivalries and motivations that go beyond mere programming. They make choices that are not optimal, and relationships that are not strategic, and decisions driven by things that look from certain angles, like feelings. Trazyn is the most extreme expression of this, because his entire existence is organized around something that could not exist in a purely mechanical being, the conviction that things are worth keeping. For a species that was told to trade everything for survival, and then discovered that what they had bought was not survival but a different kind of death, Trazyn's response is unusual. He did not rage. He did not despair, or at least not in any way he will admit to or could access emotionally. He built, he preserved. He took what was left after the furnace and turned it into something that, in 60 million years, has become genuinely extraordinary. He is, in the taxonomy of the 41st millennium's inhabitants, one of the most relatable figures in the setting. Not in the sense that his actions are relatable, they are not, but in the sense that his underlying motivation is. Who among us has not looked at the passage of time and wanted to hold something against it? Who has not, in some private moment, gathered objects around themselves that meant something, trying to create a record of a life that would otherwise leave no trace? Who has not understood, instinctively, that the things we keep are our way of insisting that we were here? Trazyn does this at galactic scale, with an army and a pocket dimension and 60 million years of accumulated intent. He does it with methods that would be crimes under any jurisdiction and in ways that cause harm to specific individuals for the benefit of an abstract historical record. But the impulse is the same. And in recognizing it, you recognize something about him that is genuinely, uncomfortably, familiarly human. Section 14. The gallery is still open. Final reflections. I want to spend a few minutes at the end of this thinking about something that I find genuinely moving about Trazyn's lore, even after spending all this time with it. 60 million years ago, a species made the worst trade in history. They gave up their souls for their lives, and found themselves with lives that were no longer worth living in any meaningful sense. They became the Walking Dead, not in the horror movie sense of shambling, mindless things, but in the deeper, quieter sense of beings who had lost access to the interior life that made existence something other than mere duration. They continued. They functioned. They persisted across timescales that make human civilization look like a footnote, and they were, in the ways that matter most, gone, all except for a handful. All except for those whose inner life was strong enough, or strange enough, or obsessive enough to survive what the furnaces took. Trazyn was one of these, and the shape of what survived in him is peculiar and broken, and doesn't work the way it should, but it works. Something in him continues to reach toward something, and something in him insists on meaning in a universe that has given his species every reason to conclude that meaning is an illusion they can no longer afford. The collection is what that reaching looks like in practice. It is massive and messy and morally indefensible, and deeply, genuinely, completely sincere. He means every exhibit. He means every catalog entry and every acquisition and every carefully labeled display case. He means the promise he made when he woke up early from the great sleep, that he would share what he found with the rest of his kind when they awakened. He means all of it, even the parts that hurt other people, because the part of him that would have understood why hurting other people is wrong is also the part that the furnaces took. What he was left with is the drive. Pure, stripped of context, no longer embedded in the emotional matrix that would have given it proportion and restraint and the capacity to be checked by compassion, but still there, still reaching, still refusing, after 60 million years, to let go. There is something in that which feels, to me, like the most honest expression of what makes Necron lore interesting. Not the battles, not the technology, or the reanimation protocols, or the tabletop mechanics. The fact that somewhere inside every Necron, every hollow metal shell following protocols and executing battlefield functions, there might be something left. Some dim persistence of whatever they used to be, still trying to remember what it was, still trying to hold on. Trazyn holds on loudly, obsessively, at galactic scale, with an army of Lichguard and a pocket dimension, and 60 million years of accumulated intent. Most of his fellow Necrons hold on in quieter ways, or do not hold on at all, or are not aware they are holding on. But the possibility that they could, the possibility that the thing the furnaces took is not completely gone, just buried very deep and very cold, is the most interesting thing about the Necrons as a fictional species. And Trazyn, the Necron who collects the dead, who refused to sleep when everyone else slept, who woke alone into a galaxy he did not recognize, and decided to catalog it rather than mourn it. Trazyn is the loudest possible argument for that possibility. He has spent 60 million years being proof that something survived. The gallery is still open, the collection continues to grow. And somewhere in the depths of Solemnace, preserved against the entropy that claims everything else, the past waits patiently for whoever comes to find it. And that is where we will leave Trazyn the Infinite, standing in his galleries, surrounded by the things he refuses to let go, patient as only something truly immortal can be patient, still adding to the catalog, still finding things worth keeping in a galaxy that is always trying to run out of them. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you, genuinely. This was a long one, because the subject deserved it, and if you are still here, you are exactly the kind of person these videos are made for. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it costs you nothing. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is significantly more lore where this came from. The Necrons alone have enough material for dozens more videos of this length. Leave a comment telling me what you thought. Tell me which piece of the collection disturbed you most. Tell me whether you think Creed is aware inside the Tesseract Labyrinth, and whether awareness there would be better or worse than not being aware. Tell me what you want to see covered next. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is, and whether the sky above you looks anything like the gray plains of Solemnace. The conversations in the comments are one of the best parts of making these, and I read all of them. The galleries are open. Come back soon. Section 15. Among the Silent Dynasty's Trazyn in Necron Politics. To understand the full scope of what Trazyn represents within his own society, you have to understand the political structure the Necrons operate within, because he is not simply an eccentric recluse who happens to have a very large museum. He is a political entity, a Necron overlord, a figure withstanding within the ancient hierarchies that govern Necron civilization, and his relationship with those hierarchies is as characteristically complicated as everything else about him. The Necrons organize themselves into dynasties. Think of them as great noble houses, ancient political units, each centered on a royal court, each governing a territory that was once part of the Necrontyr Empire before biotransference. Each dynasty has its own pharaon at its apex, its own overlords and lords governing subordinate territories, its own internal culture and military traditions and relationships with neighboring dynasties. The details vary enormously between dynasties. Some are aggressive expansionists, waking from the great sleep hungry for conquest. Some are methodical administrators who want to rebuild rather than attack. Some are fractured by internal power struggles or the mental deterioration of their senior leadership. Some have lost their leadership entirely to the personality death that afflicts those whose minds were not preserved well through 60 million years of stasis. Trazyn belongs to the Nihilakh dynasty. The Nihilakh are one of the more conservative and territorial of the major dynasties, with a particular emphasis on what they call proprietary claims, a principle that their territory, their artifacts, and their historical possessions are inviolably theirs, and that incursion into them by any outside party is grounds for extreme response. This makes them the galaxy's most ancient and best-armed property rights absolutists, which is an impressive achievement. Trazyn's relationship with the Nihilakh's proprietary philosophy is, like most of his relationships, complicated by the fact that he applies it asymmetrically. He supports the Nyalok position on his own territory. Solemnis and its surroundings are his, and he defends them with the full weight of his considerable military capability. He does not, however, apply the same principle to the territories of other dynasties or other species when he finds something there worth collecting. The proprietary claim, in his view, runs in one direction. This is not unusual hypocrisy by the standards of the powerful, but the scale on which he practices it is characteristically grand. He has, over the centuries of his renewed activity since the Great Sleep, acquired things from other Necron dynasties, from Aeldari collections, from Tau archives, from imperial museums. He has not asked, he has not compensated. He has, when confronted about specific acquisitions, been willing to discuss them and occasionally to loan items as an alternative to returning them outright, but never to acknowledge that the original acquisition was problematic. The item is in his collection now. It has been properly catalogued. This is its home. His relationship with the Nyalok leadership is accordingly one of carefully managed distance. He serves the dynasty in the sense that he has not defected to another, that he provides military capability when called upon, and information when it suits him to share it, that his territory contributes to the dynasty's overall political standing. He does not serve the dynasty in the sense of subordinating his personal agenda to its broader interests or accepting direction that would interfere with his collecting. The Pharaon of the Nyalok has presumably reached an accommodation with this situation over the many millennia of their association, because the alternative, attempting to impose genuine authority on Trazyn, would be more trouble than it is worth. Other dynasties find him useful in ways they are not entirely comfortable with. He has intelligence that nobody else has. He has been watching the galaxy continuously for 60 million years, through the Great Sleep via early wake, and his accumulated knowledge of events and entities and locations represents a resource that cannot be replicated. When major Necron leaders face decisions that depend on historical context, on understanding what something is or where something came from, on knowing the shape of the ancient world that preceded the sleep, they sometimes send queries to Solemnis. Trazyn answers when he feels like answering, declines when he does not, and occasionally sends back answers that are technically accurate but selected in ways that serve his own interests. He is, in the taxonomy of Necron political figures, something like the galaxy's most dangerous librarian. Indispensable, impossible to control, operating on agendas that are transparent in some respects, he wants things for the collection, always and completely opaque in others. The Necron lords who deal with him regularly have learned to factor him in as an unpredictable variable rather than a reliable asset. He will show up when it is interesting to him. He will provide assistance when it serves his purposes. He will take things when he wants them, from anyone who has them, and there is no mechanism available within Necron political structure for making him stop. His standing among the cryptex, the scholar-scientists, who fill the role of technical specialists within Necron society, is particularly interesting. Trazyn is himself something of an anomaly in terms of how he relates to knowledge. Most Necron overlords are warriors who delegate technical matters to their cryptex. Trazyn is functionally also a researcher, an archivist, a scientist of biological life and historical artifacts, who happens to also have the standing and military capability of an overlord. He spans categories in ways that make him difficult to place. The cryptex, who work at Solemnes, the technomancers and chronomancers and plasmancers, who maintain the galleries and operate the tesseract labyrinths and keep the hardlight containment systems running at the precise specifications required for indefinite preservation, exist in a strange relationship with their employer. They serve his obsession with an expertise that only they can provide, which gives them a certain indispensability. He values their work with a genuine respect that he does not extend to most beings, which represents a form of security. But they also have first-hand knowledge of what the galleries contain, and that knowledge is not always comfortable to carry. When you are the technomancer responsible for maintaining the stasis field that contains a fragment of a cetan, the specific nature of your working environment has implications that most professional positions do not. The Lich Guard who protect Trazyn are among the finest soldiers in any Necron army, selected for capability and maintained in conditions that keep them at peak function. They are also, in a sense, Trazyn's most immediate backup plan for his own continuity, the bodies he will inhabit if his current form is destroyed. This creates an interesting dynamic in which his bodyguards are also his emergency housing, and their capability at protecting him is therefore important on two distinct levels. They are excellent at their jobs. Whether they are comfortable with the secondary job description is not something the lore has extensively explored. His relationship with Necron, society's religious dimension, specifically the Triarch, and the institutions derived from it, is where his political standing gets most interesting. The Triarch were the ruling triad of the original Necrontyr Empire: the Pharaons, the Triarch Praetorians, and the Cryptek orders. Their institutions were supposed to continue operating across the sleep, maintaining order through whatever came. In practice, the sleep disrupted this extensively, but the Triarch's authority remains recognized in principle, if not always in practice. Trazyn, who was active for most of the sleep and has a memory of the pre-sleep political order that almost no other currently active Necron possesses, has a complicated standing relative to the Triarch traditions. He knows who the old power structures were and what they stood for, in ways that current leaders often do not. He uses this knowledge selectively, deploying historical authority when it serves him, ignoring it when it does not. He is, in a sense, the keeper of the old order's institutional memory, which gives him leverage within the Triarch framework that his own rank alone would not justify. When the Silent King returned, this dimension of Trazyn's political position became suddenly much more significant. Sarek was the apex of the original Triarch, the supreme Pharaon whose authority was absolute, whose orders had been the last command authority the Necrons operated under before the sleep. His return represented the reactivation of the oldest and most senior political authority in Necron history. Every Necron who retained sufficient cognitive function to recognize historical authority had to decide what that return meant for their own position. Trazyn's response was characteristic. He did not immediately pledge fealty. He did not refuse to recognize the Silent King. He engaged on terms that suited his interests, sharing information that was useful and withholding information that would compromise his independence. He treated the Silent King with the specific form of respect that Trazyn extends to beings he acknowledges as genuinely significant, attentive, engaged, willing to cooperate on specific things, while making clear through his behavior that he was cooperating because he chose to, not because authority compelled him. The Silent King, for his part, appears to have recognized that this was the best he was going to get from Trazyn and accepted it. A ruler who has spent 60 million years in exile has a calibrated sense of what is achievable. The Archivist of the Necrons, the Keeper of the Galleries, the being who woke from the Great Sleep with purpose intact and has been operating independently for longer than the current political order existed. This being would never be simply subordinate, but he might, on matters that genuinely engaged his interest, be something nearly as useful. Willing. Section 16. Inside the Galleries, the Deep Catalog. We have talked about some of the gallery's contents in earlier sections, but the scale and variety of what Trazyn has accumulated deserves more thorough examination. Because the collection is not just impressive in aggregate, it is revealing in detail. The specific things he chose to keep, and the way he keeps them, and the patterns visible across the full sweep of acquisitions tell you more about him than any amount of philosophical analysis. Start with the question of what he does not collect. It is a revealing negative space. He does not collect things primarily for their material value. The Necron economy, to the extent Necrons have an economy, is built on technology and territory and political influence, rather than precious metals or gemstones. Trazyn has access to enormous material wealth by any measure, but his galleries are not filled with treasures in the classic sense. He has treasures, certainly, but they are treasures for reasons other than their composition. He does not collect things that are merely powerful without being interesting. There are weapons in the Imperium, ancient, semi-functional technology from eras of superior manufacturing capability that represent enormous offensive potential. Trazyn has some of these, but they are in the galleries because they are historically significant, not because he intends to use them. A weapon that can destroy a planet is interesting primarily as a data point about the civilization that built it. He does not, as far as can be determined, collect things out of pure destructive acquisition, the impulse to take things simply because he can. There are beings in the galaxy who collect for the power demonstration inherent in the act. Trajan's acquisitions are always purposeful in a way that connects to his archival mission. He wants the thing. The wanting is real and specific. Even when the thing is large and the wanting requires significant military effort to satisfy, there is always a reason that connects back to the record he is building. What he does collect, consistently and across all eras of his active collecting, anything that represents a singular moment. The things that were only ever true once, a specimen that is the last of its kind, an artifact that was present at a specific turning point in history, an individual who participated in events that shaped the future and who will not exist again once they are gone. These are the things that Trajan pursues, with the most sustained attention and the most willingness to invest significant resources. The oldest items in his collection predate humanity. Some of them predate the Eldari Empire at its height. The Enslaver Husk we mentioned earlier, the creature from before the Key-Tangent Necrontyr deal, from before the Great Sleep, from before a significant fraction of what currently exists had been made, is among these. It is in a sealed chamber that is probably not part of any public exhibition, because explaining to visitors what an enslaver is requires contextualizing the war in heaven, which requires explaining what the war in heaven was, which requires a tour guide who has 60 million years of first-hand knowledge. Trajan may be the only available guide who qualifies. There are Old One artifacts in the deeper chambers. The Old Ones, the first truly advanced species of the current galactic epoch, who engineered much of what currently lives in the galaxy, who taught the Proto-Eldari their psychic capabilities, who created the Orks as a biological weapon and lost control of them, who were eventually overrun by the Necrons and Khitan, left behind very little. They did not leave behind monument in the way that species who expect to be remembered leave monuments. They left behind their works, the species they engineered, the webway they built, the psychic infrastructure of the galaxy. But physical artifacts attributable specifically to them are extraordinarily rare. Trajan has some. His reasoning for not making them public is, given everything else about his character, interesting. He says that displaying them would only raise questions that cannot be answered without more context than visitors can be expected to bring to the exhibition. The Old Ones left things behind, but not labels. Understanding what an Old One artifact is requires understanding what the Old Ones were and what they were trying to accomplish. And that understanding requires a companion volume of explanation that he has not finished writing. So the items sit in storage, properly cataloged in his internal systems, waiting for the exhibition context that will make them accessible. This is, you will note, a form of curatorial conscientiousness that is entirely sincere. He is not hiding the Old One artifacts. He is properly contextualizing them, and he has not finished the contextualizing yet. He has been working on it. He has been working on it for several million years, but interrupted by events, and it will be finished when it is finished. The Eldari material deserves particular attention. The Eldari have been one of the galaxy's most significant civilizations across the time span of Trajan's awareness, and their relationship with the Necrons' enemies in the war in heaven, trading partners in the immediate aftermath, increasingly peripheral as the Imperium rose, is one he has observed across its entirety. He has Eldari artifacts from the height of the Empire, before the fall of their ancient civilization created the chaos god Slanesh, in a single catastrophic psychic event. He has things that the surviving Eldari would consider sacred beyond price, kept in cases that maintain them in better condition than the craft worlds could achieve. The Eldari know some of what he has. They do not acknowledge it openly, because the options available to them in response to knowing it are limited. You cannot make Trajan give things back. You cannot assault Solemnace with enough force to take them. Attempts along these lines have been made and have failed. You cannot negotiate from a position of strength, because Trajan does not need anything the Eldari can credibly offer. You can ask, but asking has historically produced variations on the same response. He acknowledges the request, notes that the items are in excellent condition, and offers a loan arrangement for specific purposes as an alternative to return. The loan arrangement is genuine and has been used. Trajan will, under specific circumstances and for specific purposes, release items from his collection temporarily. The terms of the release are always his. The purpose must be one he considers legitimate, and the item must be returned on the schedule he specifies. His record on following through with these arrangements is actually quite good. He keeps his word when he gives it explicitly, which is one of the ways he differs from most beings who operate as he does. The items come back when he says they will come back. He is meticulous about this. The human material in the collection spans 10,000 years of the Imperium's existence, and a significant period before it. There are artifacts from the Age of Terra, before the Emperor unified Old Earth under his banner, and before humanity spread to the stars in any organized way. There are things from the Dark Age of technology, the era before the Age of Strife, before the warp storms that cut human colonies off from each other for 5,000 years, when human technological achievement was at a peak that has not been equaled since. There are things from the Horus Heresy. The Horus Heresy material is, from a pure historical significance perspective, some of the most extraordinary material in the galleries. The event that broke the Imperium at the moment of its greatest promise, that turned the Emperor's greatest sons against each other, and left the Imperium in the permanent condition of tragic half-functioning that it has, occupied ever since, is 10,000 years old. The physical materials that connect to it are extraordinarily rare. Most of them have been destroyed, lost, or deliberately suppressed by an Imperium that has complicated feelings about the period. Trajan was watching during the Horus Heresy. His collection from the period includes things that the Imperium does not know exist, and other things that the Imperium knows once existed and cannot locate. The Inquisition, specifically, would very much like access to some of these items. This creates an ongoing tension in which certain Inquisitors are aware that Trajan has things they need and are not able to get them through any mechanism that has so far been attempted. The question of Inquisitor Valeria is a particularly pointed version of this tension. She went to Solemnace to acquire specific items from the collection. She is now part of the collection. The items she came to acquire are presumably still there, and her mission to retrieve them is suspended indefinitely by her current status as an exhibit. The recursive nature of this situation collector, acquired by the collector she was attempting to investigate, has a formal perfection that Trajan would probably appreciate if you described it to him in those terms. He would also probably point out that the items she wanted to retrieve are in considerably better condition as part of his collection than they would have been under the imperial custody she intended to return them to. He is, in this as in everything else, correct in a way that misses the point entirely. The living exhibits, the prismatic galleries, represent the most ethically challenging part of the collection, and also, in terms of their conceptual ambition, the most remarkable. Suspending conscious beings in hard light, maintaining them in an awareness-adjacent state that preserves their subjectivity without allowing the passage of experienced time, is a technical achievement that no other known entity has managed. The Mechanicus has been trying to achieve something similar with mind uploading for centuries, and has produced results that range from inadequate to catastrophically counterproductive. Trajan's system works. What the occupants experience is not clear. The lore has not established definitively whether beings in the prismatic galleries have any awareness while suspended, whether they dream, whether they experience the passage of time in some attenuated form, or whether the suspension is complete and the awakening is simply the continuation of a moment that has been paused. Different accounts suggest different possibilities. The uncertainty is, in its way, the most disturbing aspect of the situation. Creed is in there. Greyfax was in there. The Catachan fighters are in there. Warriors from the early heresy era are in there. Guardsmen from regiments, whose designations no longer appear in any active imperial records. And the Death of Macharius display, which Trajan himself flagged as historically inaccurate in its original form and corrected by adding soldiers from the correct era, soldiers who were presumably alive and going about their lives in whatever corner of the galaxy they occupied until the moment Trajan needed them. These individuals are also in there. The correction of the Death of Macharius display is worth dwelling on for a moment because it illustrates something essential about how he operates. He had an exhibit that was historically inaccurate because he had used incorrect soldiers from the wrong period. This bothered him, not because it harmed anyone, not because anyone else had noticed or complained about the inaccuracy, but because it was wrong, and the gallery represents a commitment to accuracy that he takes seriously as a point of professional integrity. So he sourced correct soldiers and corrected the display. The sourcing of correct soldiers involved finding living people and using a tesseract labyrinth on them. The professional integrity that motivated the correction was genuine. The method used to achieve it was not something those soldiers would have agreed to. Both of these things are simultaneously true, and neither cancels the other out in Trajan's internal accounting, because his internal accounting does not have a column for the interests of beings he collects. The accuracy column is real and actively maintained. The consent column does not exist. This is the architecture of his ethics laid bare. He is not cruel. Cruelty implies taking pleasure in others' suffering, and he is largely indifferent to others' suffering, in ways that preclude the specific investment cruelty requires. He is not malicious. Malice implies wanting harm as an end in itself, and harm is always incidental to his ends, never the goal. He is simply operating from a value system that assigns enormous weight to preservation and accuracy, and the historical record, and minimal to no weight to the preferences of beings who happen to be the objects of that preservation. The result is indistinguishable from malice in its effects on specific individuals, but the mechanism is different, and the difference matters if you are trying to understand him rather than simply condemn him. Section 17. Trajan and the Living, his relationships with other beings. We have spent considerable time discussing what Trajan does, and some time discussing why, but we have not fully examined how he actually relates to the beings around him, the texture of his interactions, the specific ways he engages with the individuals who are significant enough in his life to constitute something like relationships. The Oricon dynamic we covered in detail, but it bears one additional layer of examination. The thing that makes their rivalry so extraordinary is not the specific conflicts they have had or the stakes of any given confrontation, but the fact that it is the closest thing to genuine emotional engagement that either of them exhibits in any consistent way. Two beings who are defined by their detachment from normal emotional experience, the archivist who collects rather than connects, the astrologist who models rather than feels, find themselves in a rivalry that generates more invested response from both of them than almost anything else in their existence. Orican's prophecies about Trajan fail. This should not be possible, because Orican's prophecies are based on calculations of extraordinary precision and depth that account for nearly all variables in any situation. The fact that they fail when Trajan is involved suggests that Trajan operates outside the parameters of Orican's models in ways that even Orican's capabilities cannot fully compensate for. There is something about Trajan specifically, his decision-making, his priorities, the specific unpredictability of someone whose governing obsession does not reduce neatly to any model that defeats the prediction apparatus. Trajan finds this delightful. He would never say so directly, but you can infer it from the frequency with which he seeks Oricon out when he could simply avoid him, the frequency with which he does things that will specifically annoy Oricon when neutral options were available. The fact that he keeps the Astrarium Mysterios, the device he stole, the device whose loss has haunted Oricon across millennia, not hidden away, but within Oricon's awareness. He does not flaunt it openly, but he does not hide it. The Astrarium is in the collection. Oricon knows it is in the collection. Trajan knows Oricon knows. This is not an accident. He enjoys being someone that Oricon cannot predict. In a life characterized by the absence of many of the things that make life enjoyable, being the thing that breaks the model is a pleasure available to him. His relationship with the Mechanicus figures he encounters is another instructive case. Archmagos Call, whom he met at Cadia, represents a peer in a specific way that most beings Trajan encounters do not. Call has been operating for 10,000 years, a fraction of Trajan's duration, but enough to produce a perspective that is qualitatively different from most of the beings around him. He has seen empires rise. He has watched the slow erosion of things he built with his own hands. He understands what it means to maintain a project across a timescale that outlasts the people who were alive when it started. Trajan's conversations with Call, in the Gathering Storm narratives, have a quality that his conversations with most others lack: reciprocity. Call asks questions that Trajan considers worth answering. Trajan provides information that Call actually uses. They are, briefly, collaborating not because either of them particularly wanted a collaborator, but because the specific problem of the Cadian pylons required both of what they knew. Two very old, very strange beings who have outlived everyone they originally worked with, finding that their individually siloed expertise is more effective in combination than in isolation. There is something almost wistful in how Trajan engages with Call, or at least something that reads as wistful from the outside. Here is someone who actually understands something about the span of time Trazyn has navigated. Here is someone who knows what the passage of centuries does to a project, and to a consciousness, and to the framework of meaning in which you originally embedded both. The conversation they have is primarily technical and tactical. But under the technical exchange, there is, perhaps, something that neither of them would name as connection, but that functions like one. His relationship with Inquisitor Greyfax, after he releases her into the Battle of the Cadian Underground, is a compact masterpiece of a specific kind of dynamic. She was his prisoner for an indeterminate period of centuries. He installed mind-shackle scarabs in her that prevent her from harming him. She is a senior inquisitor of the Puritan faction, meaning she is exactly the kind of imperial authority figure that should be most hostile to a Necron overlord, and she is personally motivated to hostility in ways that go beyond professional obligation. She is furious at him. She acts on that fury whenever the mind-shackle scarabs permit, which is never when it most matters. And he, for his part, treats her fury with something that looks, from a certain angle, like appreciation. She is exactly what she presents as being: an inquisitor of the old school, a true believer, an authentic example of the kind of person the Imperium produces when it is functioning as intended. Someone who has made themselves entirely into the instrument of their institution. He collects, among other things, examples of significant things in their most complete expression. Greyfax is a complete expression. Her fury at him is appropriate, accurate, well-founded, and characteristic of the type. He can appreciate it the same way he appreciates an Eldar artifact for embodying the specific aesthetic philosophy of its period. She shot at him during the battle. The scarab stopped her. She shot at him again. The scarab stopped her again. He noted this with what appears to have been equanimity, adjusted his position slightly to keep his attention on the actual enemies rather than on her attempts on his person, and continued fighting. At the end of the battle, before he teleported away, he left her free of the scarab's influence. He could not do this earlier, because she would have attacked him at a critical tactical moment. But at the end, with the fighting done, he released the constraint. This is, again, a completely practical decision made on entirely practical grounds. He needed her operational, and he needed her not actively trying to kill him during the same time window. When those requirements were no longer in conflict, he released the constraint. But it also looks, from outside, like the closest thing to grace that his capabilities permit. He could have kept the scarabs in her. She would not have been able to make him remove them. He chose to remove them anyway, at the moment when doing so cost him nothing. That choice, that small, practical, not particularly heroic choice, is one of the more revealing moments in his catalog of actions. The mind-shackle scarabs staying in would have been no trouble. The mind-shackle scarabs coming out was, on some level, a choice to acknowledge that what had been necessary was no longer necessary, and that she deserved to have that acknowledged, even if she would have preferred never to have been caught in the first place. He contains multitudes. All of them are strange. Some of them are worse than others. But they are all genuinely his, all the way down. Section 18. The weight of 60 million years. What duration does to a mind. There is a question that sits underneath everything else in this video, and that I have been circling without fully engaging. So let's engage it directly now. What does 60 million years do to a consciousness? The human reference point is inadequate here. The oldest people who have ever lived were barely past 100 years. The psychological literature on aging, on what the accumulation of decades does to a mind, and its relationship to its own history, caps out at durations that are a negligible fraction of Trazyn's span. We have no framework built from experience that maps to this. We have to build one from inference and analogy, and we have to accept that the result will be incomplete. What we know from the lore is that the Great Sleep itself, the stasis period, was not simply dreamless rest. Necrons describe it in ways that suggest it was its own kind of experience, or at least that the emergence from it is experienced as a gap rather than a continuation. You go in with one frame of reference. You come out to find that everything has changed. Your frame of reference has no external anchors left, and the being that went in is connected to the being that comes out primarily by the fact of memory, rather than by any felt continuity. Trazyn did not experience the full Great Sleep in the way others did. He woke early, He was active through much of the intervening period. His experience of duration is therefore different from that of a Necron who slept for 60 million years and woke to find the current galaxy. He has lived through the time rather than skipping it, which sounds better until you consider that living through 60 million years while being increasingly separated from the emotional context that gives experience meaning is a different kind of terrible from simply waking up in the wrong era. He has watched species rise and fall, not metaphorically. He has literal memories of being present during the ascendancy of civilizations that no longer exist in any form, not in ruins, not in descendants, not in records that anyone else currently holds. He watched them, he collected from them, he cataloged them, and then they were gone. And the collected objects in his galleries are the only remaining evidence that they existed. Think about what that accumulation does. Every new species he encounters, he is simultaneously seeing it fresh and seeing it against the backdrop of every species he has watched disappear. The humans he meets are people, but they are also the current instance of the pattern he has watched play out across multiple civilizations, the pattern of a young species at the peak of its confidence, building things with the fervor of beings who believe they will last, not knowing that they occupy a specific position in a developmental arc that has a well-documented end. He does not tell them this. What would be the point? The civilizations that came before them did not benefit from being told. The ones that followed did not either. There is no telling that changes the arc. There is only collecting, only preserving, only making sure that when the arc completes, something remains that proves the arc happened. His relationship to his own memories across this span is not simply the storage and retrieval system it might superficially appear to be. Memory, across the durations he has navigated, becomes something different from what the word means to beings with shorter lives. Some memories are sharp and specific, preserved in perfect detail because they are cataloged with the same precision he applies to everything else. Others have the quality of pattern rather than event. He knows that certain kinds of things happened, certain kinds of ways, without retaining the specific instance that first established the pattern. Some of the oldest memories have the texture of myth. He knows they are his own experiences, and not stories he was told, but they feel like stories, distant and shaped by the distance, lacking the immediacy that fresh memory carries. The self-installed amnesia around his pre-biotransference life sits at the center of this. 60 million years of memory, interrupted by a gap, everything before the furnace, sealed. Everything after, available, with varying degrees of vividness depending on age and significance, and the care with which he cataloged it at the time. He is a being who contains an enormous continuous record of the galaxy's history, with a hole in the middle that corresponds exactly to the most personal and significant period of his existence. This hole was his choice. He installed the protocols himself. Orkan's revelation that the amnesia was voluntary, not a side effect of biotransference, is one of the most important pieces of information in his lore because of what it implies about his state of mind at the moment of making that choice. He was newly embodied in metal. He was freshly stripped of the biological substrate of his emotional life. He was the archivist who had become an archive, the one who kept things made into something that things were kept in. And he decided, in that moment, that he did not want to remember what it had felt like to be the person he was before. Why? The most plausible answer. Because the contrast was unbearable. Because remembering clearly what it had felt like to be fully alive while existing in the hollowed-out aftermath of biotransference was a form of suffering that he could not accommodate within the framework he needed to maintain in order to continue functioning. The loss was too immediate, too precisely mapped against what still existed and what did not. So he sealed the before away and kept only the after, and the collecting became the bridge, the behavior that connected the before self. He could not access to the after self that needed a purpose to organize itself around. In 60 million years, that bridge has become the whole structure. The original purpose of the collecting, whether it was the coping mechanism it appears from this angle to have been, or whether it was always simply the thing he was, is inaccessible. What remains is the collecting itself, vast and self-sustaining and still reaching, still adding, still insisting that things should not disappear just because the galaxy has decided they should. He has been alone in a fundamental sense for 60 million years. Not without companions, he has his Lichguard, his Cryptex, his ongoing antagonism with Oricon that serves some of the social functions of genuine friendship. But alone in the sense that there is no one who shares his specific perspective, no one who has been where he has been and seen what he has seen and made the same choices and carries the same weight. There is no peer relationship available to him that matches the particular shape of his experience. Perhaps this is why the collection matters so much. The objects he preserves are, in a sense, the audience he cannot otherwise access. The things in the galleries know what he knows. They have been through the eras he has been through. They carry the marks of the moments he remembers. They are the evidence that the things he has lived through were real and significant, rather than increasingly distant and uncertain. He talks to them, in the sense that he catalogs them and arranges them, and spends time with them in the manner of a person who finds genuine companionship in the past. This is, if you hold it in a certain light, the most moving thing about him. The oldest being in the galaxy, the archivist of a lost civilization, the keeper of 60 million years of history, and the primary relationship he has maintained across that entire span is with the objects in his care, with the things that he keeps so they will not be gone. He keeps them so something will still be here that was there. He keeps them because keeping things is the only love he has left that still works. Section 19. The Art of the Acquisition. Trazin's methods in detail. One of the things that distinguishes Trazin from the straightforwardly villainous is the quality of preparation he brings to each acquisition. He is not a creature of impulse. When he wants something, he plans, he researches, he models the situation from multiple angles and identifies the approach most likely to succeed before committing resources. The planning process can take years, sometimes decades, before a single move is made. And then when the move happens, it tends to be decisive. The Spear of Vulcan is the clearest example of a plan that failed, repeatedly, and what that failure reveals about him. The spear is a relic of the Salamander's Space Marine chapter, a sacred weapon attributed to their primarch, Vulcan, one of the Emperor's sons. Sacred relics of this type occupy an interesting category in Trazin's classification system. They are simultaneously historical artifacts of the highest significance, being physical objects that connect directly to the founding mythologies of human space marine culture, and functional weapons of considerable power. They are also among the most heavily guarded objects in the Imperium, because a space marine chapter that loses its founding relic has experienced one of the worst things that can happen to a space marine chapter. Trazin attempted to acquire the Spear of Vulcan twice. Both times, he failed. The exact nature of both failures is not fully detailed in available lore. The Salamanders are not the sort of chapter that publishes detailed post-action reports on near-catastrophic encounters with ancient Xenos. But what is known is that he was thwarted both times, and that the spear remains with the chapter. This is interesting for several reasons. First, Trazin fails sometimes. He is not omnipotent. His capabilities are extraordinary, and his planning is meticulous, but he encounters situations where the specific combination of factors defeats even his preparation, and in those situations, he retreats and reassesses rather than committing to a confrontation that he calculates he cannot win. This is the behavior of someone who has been operating across a very long time horizon, who understands that an objective that cannot be achieved today might be achievable under different circumstances, and that destroying himself in pursuit of it immediately accomplishes nothing. Second, the failure did not end his interest in the spear. He has made 2 attempts. There is no indication that he has written it off. It is presumably still on a list somewhere in Solemnace's cataloging systems, flagged for reconsideration when circumstances change. He keeps what he means to keep, and he is patient about keeping it. 60 million years of patience cannot be shaken by 2 temporary setbacks. The acquisition of the Tanith ghosts, or a significant portion of their regiment, is a different kind of case study. The Tanith first and only, the regiment founded by Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt from the planet Tanith before it was destroyed in the early stages of their formation, are one of the more celebrated Imperial Guard units in the lore. They serve as the central figures of Dan Abnett's Gaunt's Ghosts novel series, one of the most beloved long-running narratives in the Warhammer fiction library. The detail that some portion of them ended up in Trazin's collection is present in the lore, and has been the source of significant speculation and discussion. It is, in its way, perfectly calibrated to the things Trazyn finds worth keeping. The Tanith are themselves refugees from a destroyed world. They carry their planet's identity with them, their name, their traditions, their scouting culture, their specific way of being, because their planet is gone and they are all that remains of it. They are, collectively, a living archive of Tanith civilization, a culture preserved in the people rather than in the place. Trazyn would understand that immediately. He would recognize in them the specific kind of significance that he specializes in the last representatives of something, the people who are the evidence that their world existed, the beings who are, themselves, the record that needs preserving. Whether his acquisition of a portion of them was a rescue or a taking, an act of strange mercy or straightforward collection, depends on which moment you examine and which angle you approach from. Both interpretations have support in the surrounding circumstances. Neither is the whole picture. This is again the defining texture of engaging with Trazyn. Both things are always true. The mercy is real and the taking is real, and they are the same action, and you cannot separate them into the good part and the bad part, because the method is inseparable from the impulse, and the impulse is genuinely shaped by something that, in a different context, would look entirely like care. His approach to living acquisitions, the ones that go into the prismatic galleries or the tesseract labyrinths rather than the static display cases, shows a consistency of methodology that spans species and eras. He identifies beings of significance. He confirms the significance through research or direct observation, or both. He identifies the moment at which acquiring them becomes possible without cost that exceeds the acquisition's value. He acquires them at that moment. He catalogs them with the same meticulous attention he gives to the static objects. He moves on to the next acquisition. The moment of acquisition is consistently chosen to coincide with a moment at which the subject would otherwise face death or terminal transformation. Greyfax, at a point in her imprisonment that made her situation permanently problematic. The Catachan fighters, a situation in the Ork moon fort that left no good outcomes through normal channels. Creed, during the fall of Cadia, while the planet died around him. This is not consistent coincidence. It is consistent methodology. He acquires at the last moment before loss, because the last moment is when the acquisition prevents something that would otherwise occur when he is, by his own accounting, saving rather than taking. Whether the people he acquires experience the difference between being taken and being saved is another question. The lore has the wisdom not to fully resolve. Section 20. Laughter in the Dark. Trazyn's humor and what it reveals. There is one more dimension of Trazyn that deserves its own space before we close, because it is the dimension most easily overlooked and most revealing once you see it. He is genuinely, consistently, self-awarely funny. Not accidentally funny, in the way that a being with broken ethics and enormous power produces situations that are darkly comic through the collision of his methods with everyone else's expectations. Genuinely funny, deliberate, dry, self-aware, and deployed with the precision of someone who has studied comedy for 60 million years and understands exactly what makes something land. He names his exhibits with a curator's love of the perfectly calibrated label: Last Stand of Ursarkar Creed, Death of Macharius. These are not merely descriptive titles. They have a weight to them, a distance, a framing that creates space between the enormous significance of the events described and the clinical calm of the museum label. The contrast is comic in a way that requires intelligence to create and intelligence to appreciate. He knows what he is doing with those labels. The Last Stand label was prepared in advance. He knew what the label would say before the exhibit was acquired, which means he had already framed the ending before it happened, which means the label is a joke about inevitability as much as it is a description of an exhibit. His correspondence with Orkan, as documented in The Infinite and the Divine, is a sustained demonstration of his comedic capabilities. The letters they exchange are masterclasses in a specific kind of wit, the wit of beings who know each other very well and are using that knowledge as a weapon while maintaining plausible deniability about the hostility of the wit. Exchange. He writes to Orkan in a register that is perfectly calibrated to be insulting in ways that cannot quite be directly addressed without Waaaagh appearing to have taken offense at something that sounds, in isolation, like a reasonable statement. He compliments Waaagh's work in ways that are structurally indistinguishable from criticism. He expresses concern for Waaagh's capabilities in ways that are structurally indistinguishable from contempt. And Waaaagh, who is himself brilliant and similarly skilled at this mode of communication, gives back as good as he gets. Their correspondence is one of the most entertaining things in current Black Library fiction, and it is entertaining specifically because both parties are completely sincere in their hostility, while operating through a register of formal politeness that never quite breaks. Two beings who genuinely cannot stand each other, expressing it through the medium of exquisitely crafted letters that would read to an outsider as civilized academic exchange. Trazyn's interactions with the beings he collects in the moments before or after collection, in the brief exchanges that occur, when he releases things from stasis for specific purposes, consistently show the same quality. He is aware of the absurdity of his position, not ashamed of it, not defensive about it, simply aware, and willing to acknowledge the awareness obliquely, in ways that reveal his understanding of how he appears without requiring him to apologize for it. When he told Creed that eternity awaited, he was not being rhetorical, he meant it literally. But the framing eternity awaits, as if the Tesseract Labyrinth were a promotion rather than a jar, is a choice. He could have said something clinically accurate. He chose something that sounded, to a human ear, like dignity. Whether it was dignity or its precise echo performing dignity's function is a question he would probably find more interesting than distressing. This quality of self-awareness, running beneath the collecting obsession, is one of the things that makes him genuinely engaging as a character, rather than simply interesting as a concept. A character who is entirely unaware of their absurdity is a different kind of interesting from a character who is entirely aware of it and proceeds anyway. The awareness implies something about the interior life still running the observer behind the obsession, the consciousness that can stand slightly outside the collecting drive and see it from the outside, even while being completely governed by it. The laughing at himself, or the nearest thing available to laughing at himself, is the most human thing about him. The one thing that sounds most clearly like the person he used to be, the chief archivist who knew that his obsession was an obsession and found it amusing rather than troubling. That person is sealed behind protocols and buried under 60 million years of metal existence and the slow erosion of everything that was originally warm about him. But the humor is still there. The wit is still there. Something in there still knows that all of this is, if you step back far enough and look at it from the right angle, extraordinarily funny. He is the galaxy's greatest collector. He has been at it for 60 million years. He has an exhibit of the Lord Castellan of Cadia, and an Inquisitor who keeps trying to shoot him, and a Cetan shard in a jar and a rivalry with a prophecy machine that he has defeated so consistently that the prophecy machine's failures have become part of the expected pattern. And somewhere in the deepest, most sealed-off chamber of Solemnace, in the section that has no catalog entry and no public access, and no label visible to anyone, there is probably an exhibit that he has built for himself, something that connects to the person he cannot remember being. Something that proves he was here, before the furnaces, before the metal, before the 60 million years of careful, meticulous, relentless collecting. Something he keeps not because it is historically significant, but because it is his. The galleries are still open, the collection continues to grow, and the archivist, who refused to sleep, walks among his exhibits, reading the labels he wrote himself, remembering the things he chose to keep. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and entropy and the patient heat death of everything that ever mattered, he is still there, still adding to the catalog, still insisting that things are worth keeping. And that, if nothing else, is something worth remembering. Section 21. The Last Archivist of Final Accounting. When you step all the way back and look at the full picture, the 60 million years, the galleries of Solemnace, the rivals and prisoners, and collected armies, the Cadian pylons, and the Cetan shard in a jar, and the label prepared before the exhibit arrived. What you are looking at is a being who has accomplished something that has no precedent in the history of any species. The galaxy has produced. He built a memory for a civilization that could not keep its own memories. He decided, at the moment when everything was taken, that he would be the one who remembered. Not because anyone asked him to, Not because the role was assigned, or the obligation was formal, or the alternative was unacceptable, but because the impulse was there, and the capacity was there, and after the furnaces took everything else, those two things remained and pointed in the same direction. Think about what the Necrons woke to find. Those who have emerged from the Great Sleep in the current era. They went under in a galaxy they knew that was built around the arrangements that made sense to beings like them. They woke to find that 60 million years had passed, and everything had changed so thoroughly that nothing from before was recognizable in the form it had taken. Their stellar empires had been settled by alien races who do not know the Necrons built the infrastructure those civilizations are built on. Their history exists only in fragments, most of them lost. The Satan who deceived them have been shattered. The silent king who ordered the sleep returned only recently. The context for everything they were has largely ceased to exist, except for the galleries of Solemnes, except for the records that Trazyn kept while they slept. The meticulous, obsessive, 60-million-year archive that he built through methods no one would have endorsed, collecting things from people who did not agree to be collected, preserving moments that would otherwise have been gone forever. Every Necron who wakes and wants to understand what happened, who needs to know what grew up while they were absent, what civilizations rose and what civilizations fell, what significant things occurred across the unimaginable span of their sleep, can go to Solemnes and find it. He kept his promise. The one he made when he woke early, alone in the great sleep, looking out at a galaxy he did not recognize, and deciding, somehow, that his response to that recognition would not be despair but documentation. He kept the record. He kept it for 60 million years, through the entire duration of the sleep and the full period of the current era, through wars and extinctions and the rise and fall of things that have no place in any other archive, for all the damage his methods have caused, for all the harm that his absence of normal ethical function has produced in the lives of specific beings who had the misfortune to be historically significant at the wrong moment, for all of the philosophical problems and the moral complexity and the legitimate horror that attaches to specific things in the collection. He is also the one who was there, the one who stayed awake, the one who decided that nothing should disappear without a record and then spent 60 million years making sure it did not. In a galaxy full of things that are trying to consume and destroy and obliterate, he is the thing that is trying to keep, the archivist who became the archive. The collector who is, himself, a collection, a compendium of 60 million years of insistence that things matter, that the past deserves to be remembered, that something should survive the entropy that claims everything else. That is, Trazyn the Infinite. The last archivist of the Necrons, the one who remembered. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely, sincerely, thank you. This was a long journey, and Trazyn deserves every minute of it. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. It takes a second, and it means a great deal for the channel. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is significantly more lore of this depth and this length waiting to be made, and you do not want to miss it. Leave a comment. Tell me which exhibit disturbs you most. Tell me whether you think Creed is aware in the Tesseract Labyrinth. Tell me where you are reading this from, what time it is there, whether the sky above you looks anything like the pale gray plains of Solemnes. The conversations in the comments are some of the best conversations that happen around this channel, and every single one of them gets read. The gallery is always open. Come back soon.